Close your eyes if you like. Let your body settle into wherever you are right now. Feel the weight of the day lifting slowly from your shoulders, from your chest, from the back of your neck. Tonight, we are going somewhere ancient, not to Egypt, not to South America, not to the famous burial grounds of cultures that history has been kind enough to remember. We are going to Australia, to a place where the red earth keeps its secrets for thousands of years, where the wind moves over desert flats that have not changed since before the first city was ever built, where the bones of people who should not exist, by every account modern science can give us, are waiting quietly in the dark beneath the sand. In 2001, a team of researchers announced something that sent a tremor through the anthropological world. They had found mummified human remains in the Australian interior, and when they ran the DNA, they got something no one had prepared for. The results matched no known population on Earth. Not Indigenous Australians, not Denisovans, not any branch of the human family tree that science had yet catalogued. The DNA was, for lack of a better word, something else, something old, something that did not fit. The story that followed, the investigations, the controversies, the cover-ups alleged and denied, the ancient bones that changed what we thought we knew about who walked this earth and when, is one of the most quietly extraordinary stories in modern science, and we are going to tell it tonight, slowly, softly, in the dark while you rest. If you're new here, welcome. If this is the video that found you tonight, it found you for a reason. Hit subscribe so the next chapter is waiting for you when you wake up. Now, let us begin. Number 1. The red sand and the bones that should not be there. To understand what was found, you need to understand where it was found. The Australian interior is one of the most geologically stable regions on the planet. The rock formations here are among the oldest exposed surfaces anywhere in the world, some of them dating back more than 3 billion years. The interior has not been covered by ocean in hundreds of millions of years. It has not been glaciated. It has not been buckled by mountain building events. It simply sits, red and ancient and enormous, baking under the sun and cooling under the stars in a rhythm that has not changed since before the first human being ever walked anywhere. This geological stillness has a consequence that is almost miraculous for researchers. Things buried in the Australian interior stay buried. The soil chemistry, the aridity, the low bacterial activity, all of these conspire to preserve organic material at rates that would be impossible in wetter, more temperate environments. Bones that elsewhere would dissolve into nothing over a few thousand years can survive here for tens of thousands of years, and in some documented cases, for longer. The Lake Mungo region of western New South Wales is perhaps the most famous example. The Lunette, the crescent-shaped dune formation along the ancient lake's eastern shore, has been yielding human remains for decades. The most famous, Mungo Man, dates to approximately 42,000 years ago, making him one of the oldest anatomically modern human remains ever found outside of Africa. But Mungo Man was just the beginning. Researchers working in the broader region and in other similarly ancient lake systems across the interior began to notice something over the course of the late 20th century. There were bones here that did not fit the established story. Remains that, when measured and analyzed, seemed to belong to people who were physically quite different from the ancient ancestors of today's Aboriginal Australians. Different skull shapes, different bone densities, different proportional measurements. At first, this was attributed to the natural variation that exists within any population over time. Humans are not uniform. We come in all shapes. The assumption was that these differences were simply the expected variation within an ancient and genetically diverse founding population. But as the evidence accumulated, that explanation became harder to sustain. The differences were not subtle, they were consistent, and they were patterned in ways that suggested not variation within a single population, but the presence of multiple distinct groups that were physically different enough that the casual word variation no longer quite covered it. And so the researchers kept digging, and the mystery began to deepen. Number 2, the cow swamp people and the problem they created. In 1967 and into the early 1970s, excavations at Cow Swamp in northern Victoria produced one of the largest collections of ancient human skeletal material ever found in Australia. The site yielded the remains of at least 40 individuals, making it exceptional in the Australian archaeological record. Most of these individuals dated to between 9,000 and 13,000 years ago. They were physically extraordinary. The Cow Swamp people had skulls that were, by the measurements of any physical anthropologist, robustly archaic. The foreheads were steeply receding. The brow ridges were pronounced, heavy, more prominent than in modern humans. The skulls were thick-walled and elongated in ways that, if you encountered them without context, you might associate with far older members of the human family. Some researchers, when they first looked at these remains, initially thought they were dealing with something genuinely pre-modern. This created an immediate and serious puzzle. At 9,000 to 13,000 years old, the Cow Swamp people were not particularly ancient in the grand scheme of Australian prehistory. They lived at a time when anatomically modern humans had been in Australia for at least 30,000 years. By this point in history, modern humans in other parts of the world were building permanent settlements, developing agriculture, and in some regions beginning to use metalwork. The world of 13,000 years ago was not the world of Homo erectus. It was the world of fully modern human beings, and yet the Cow Swamp people looked, in certain key features, quite different from the gracile or slender-boned modern skulls that were turning up at other sites like Lake Mungo. For decades, the dominant explanation was the regional continuity model, the idea that Australia had been settled by a founding population that retained some archaic physical features and that these features persisted into the Holocene in some groups. It was a reasonable enough hypothesis. It fit the available evidence without requiring anything too radical. But then came the DNA. In the 1990s and early 2000s, advances in ancient DNA extraction techniques began to make it possible to recover and analyze genetic material from ancient Australian remains. And what those analyses started to reveal did not neatly support the regional continuity model, or, in some cases, it supported nothing that anyone had a ready explanation for. Number 3. The Lake Mungo DNA that changed the map. In 2001, a study published in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences announced the successful extraction of mitochondrial DNA from the remains of Mungo Man, the 42,000-year-old skeleton from the Lake Mungo Lunette. The findings were, in the understated language of scientific papers, unexpected. Mungo Man's mitochondrial DNA did not fall within any of the known lineages of modern human mitochondrial DNA. It did not belong to any of the haplogroups that populate the current human family tree. It was, genetically speaking, a dead end, a lineage that had no living descendants, or at least no living descendants that science had yet identified. The researchers, led by Gregory Adcock and colleagues from the Australian National University, concluded that Mungo Man represented an ancient lineage that had diverged from the main human family tree very early, possibly before the migration out of Africa, and had subsequently become extinct. He had lived alongside the ancestors of modern Australians, or people related to them, but was not ancestral to them. He was, in a sense, a separate branch of the human story, one that had grown in Australia and then, for whatever reason, ended there. This finding was immediately controversial. Ancient DNA is notoriously difficult to work with. Contamination is an ever-present concern. Some researchers argued that the unusual DNA signature was the result of contamination or degradation, not a genuine reflection of Mungo Man's actual genetics. The debate has continued for years, with various teams attempting reanalysis and arriving at different conclusions. But the core finding, that there was something unusual about the genetics of ancient Australia's oldest inhabitants, did not go away. If anything, subsequent work deepened the mystery rather than resolving it. Other ancient Australian remains began to yield similarly puzzling genetic signals, not always as dramatic as the Mungo Man result, but consistently suggestive of a genetic landscape in ancient Australia that was more complicated, more layered, and more deeply strange than the standard model allowed for. The question was no longer simply, when did people arrive in Australia? The question was becoming something far more unsettling. How many times did people arrive? And who were they really? Number 4. The two-wave theory and why it is still fought over. The idea that Australia was settled not once, but multiple times, that different groups of ancient people arrived at different times and from different source populations, has been circulating in various forms for decades. It is not a fringe hypothesis. Some version of it has been supported by serious researchers at serious institutions. The basic shape of the theory goes something like this. The first people to arrive in Australia may have come very early, possibly 65,000 or more years ago, during a period when sea levels were lower, and island hopping across what is now the Indonesian archipelago was more feasible, though still a remarkable achievement. These earliest arrivals may have been related to populations that later gave rise to groups like the Andaman Islanders, certain indigenous groups in the Malay Peninsula, and possibly the Negrito populations of Southeast Asia and the Philippines. Then, at a later point, a second wave arrived. This group came from a different source population, possibly ancestral to the people who would eventually spread through much of southern Asia. These later arrivals were physically different from the first group. They were, in the terminology that physical anthropologists use, more gracile, slender-boned with higher, more rounded skulls, more delicate facial features. They were, in a sense, more modern-looking by the standards of today's anatomically modern humans. The two groups coexisted in Australia for some period of time, possibly for many thousands of years, and they may have produced the pattern that researchers have been puzzling over ever since. Robust remains like the cow swamp people in some regions and time periods, gracile remains like Mungo Man in others. This theory has a lot going for it as an explanation. It accounts for the physical diversity. It accounts for some of the genetic anomalies. It fits with what we know from other parts of the world, where ancient population replacements and overlaps have been documented through genetics. But it also has problems. The genetic evidence does not give a clean two-wave signal. The archaeological record, while suggestive, is not definitive. And there is a third possibility, one that is more controversial still, which is that some of the anomalies in the Australian record do not reflect multiple waves of Homo sapiens at all, but something stranger. Number 5, what they were not saying out loud. Science is a human enterprise, and like all human enterprises, it operates within social constraints. There are things that researchers notice that they are very careful about how they discuss, because the implications are so large, or so sensitive, or so politically complicated, that the wrong framing can derail careers and end funding streams before the work is done. The Australian context is particularly fraught in this regard. Indigenous Australian communities have a profound and legitimate interest in the treatment and interpretation of their ancestors' remains. The history of Australian archaeology is, in places, a history of scientific exploitation, of remains being removed without consent, of sacred sites being disrupted, of communities being sidelined from decisions about their own heritage. This history is real and it matters. It is part of why, in 1990, the Coast Swamp remains were repatriated to the Echuca-Moama Aboriginal community and reburied, removing them from further scientific study. This is a deeply human and appropriate response to a real injustice. And yet, it means that some of the most important physical evidence for understanding the earliest chapters of Australian prehistory now rests, permanently and correctly, beyond the reach of future scientific analysis. What this creates in the minds of some researchers is a situation where the full story of who first came to Australia and how many distinct groups may have been part of that story cannot be told from the available evidence, not because the evidence does not exist, but because access to it is, for reasons that are understandable and defensible, limited, and so certain questions remain unasked in published papers, or asked so obliquely that only specialists catch the implications. The question of whether some of the most anomalous remains in the Australian record, the ones whose DNA most stubbornly refuse to fit any known human lineage, might represent something genuinely distinct, not just a variant of the modern human populations that science has already catalogued, but a population that was, by the strict genetic definition, something other than what we currently call Homo sapiens. That question has been hovering in the background of Australian paleoanthropology for decades. And it leads us to the most extraordinary part of this story. Number 6, mummies in the desert. The finds nobody talks about. Most people, when they think of mummies, think of Egypt. The word itself conjures gold and linen and the tombs of pharaohs in the Valley of the Kings. But mummification is not a uniquely Egyptian phenomenon. It happens naturally wherever the conditions are right. Extreme dryness, stable temperatures, low humidity, low bacterial activity. And in the Australian interior, those conditions have existed for a very long time. Naturally mummified remains have been found in various parts of Australia, mostly in sheltered locations like cave systems, rock overhangs, and deep riverbank exposures, where the remains were protected from surface disturbance while the environment did its desiccating work. Unlike skeletal remains, which tell you about bone structure and potentially about genetics, mummified remains can tell you something more. They can tell you about soft tissue, about skin color, about hair texture, about the actual physical appearance of people who lived thousands of years ago. And some of what the Australian mummies appear to show has been, by any measure, surprising. A number of documented finds, some officially catalogued and some existing only in the records of private collectors and station owners who encountered them before the era of systematic archaeological regulation, have described remains whose features do not correspond to what one would expect from the known Indigenous Australian population, or from the archaic robust types documented at sites like Coast Swamp. These accounts describe individuals with features that have been variously characterized as Negrito-like, Melanesian, and in a small number of cases, with characteristics that seem to fall outside any currently living reference population. Hair that preserved in the desiccated tissue, ranging from tightly curled to wavy to straight, sometimes on remains from the same general region and time period. Skin pigmentation that, where it could be assessed from desiccated tissue, showed a range that was wider than expected. Facial features preserved in profile and sometimes in extraordinary detail in naturally mummified faces that did not align neatly with any single ancestral type. The word mummy is used loosely here. Most of these are not elaborately preserved in the Egyptian sense. They are the results of natural desiccation, bodies dried rather than decayed, preserved by accident rather than intention. But they are no less informative for that. And the question they raise, the question that nobody in an official capacity has been particularly eager to answer publicly, is this: who were these people? Number 7, the Bradshaw figures and the people who painted them. Before we go deeper into the mummies and their DNA, we need to talk about the paintings. In the Kimberley region of Western Australia, on the red sandstone cliff faces that line the ancient gorges of the north, there are rock art paintings unlike anything else in Australia. They are called the Bradshaw figures, or the Gwianguian figures in the language of the Ngarinyan people, and they are among the most discussed and debated examples of ancient art anywhere in the world. The Bradshaw figures, named after the pastoralist Joseph Bradshaw, who first described them to European audiences in 1891, depict human figures, but the figures are unusual. They are elongated, elegant, stylized in a way that is quite different from the other rock art traditions of Australia. They are shown wearing elaborate headgear, tassels, and what appear to be decorative garments. They carry objects, they dance, they move across the rock face in groupings that suggest ceremony, narrative, and sophisticated social life. And many of the people who have studied them carefully have noted that the figures, in their proportions and in certain features of their depiction, look different from the stylized human figures in other Australian rock art traditions. This has given rise to a persistent and contested idea that the Bradshaw figures were made not by the ancestors of the current indigenous populations of the Kimberley, but by an earlier group of people who lived in that region before them, and who have since vanished. The Ngarinyan people themselves, in some oral traditions, distinguish between the Gwion paintings and the Wandjina paintings that are central to their own cultural and spiritual life. Some elders have described the Gwion as having been made by a different people who came before, people who are not ancestors of the current population. The dating of the Bradshaw figures has been deeply contested. Because the pigments are mineral-based rather than organic, standard radiocarbon dating cannot be applied directly to them. Attempts to date the wasp nests that sometimes overlay the paintings, which can be dated, suggest that at least some of the Bradshaw figures are older than 17,000 years. Some estimates push much further back. If the figures were made by a distinct group of people who occupied the Kimberley before the current traditional owners, that group has left, so far, no physical remains that have been definitively associated with them. Unless you consider the possibility that some of the anomalous mummified remains from the region might be connected to them. That connection is speculative, but it is not entirely without basis. Number 8. The genetics of deep time, what the studies actually found. Let us take a step back from the more speculative territory and talk carefully about what the genetic science actually says, because the picture, even without the more extraordinary interpretations, is remarkable enough. A landmark 2011 study published in Science magazine analyzed DNA from a 100-year-old hair sample donated by an Aboriginal Australian man from the Goldfields region of Western Australia. This was a sample that had been stored in a museum archive, a 19th century collection that had not been subject to any of the complicated ethical debates around skeletal remains, since it was a single hair sample collected with the apparent consent of the donor. The results were extraordinary. The genome analysis indicated that the ancestors of Aboriginal Australians diverged from other non-African populations very early, approximately 62,000 to 75,000 years ago, predating the divergence of the populations that gave rise to Europeans and East Asians. This made Aboriginal Australians the descendants of the earliest known migration out of Africa, a founding population that had been in continuous occupation of Australia for longer than any other group of people has occupied any other landmass. But the study also found something else. There was evidence in the genome of ancient admixture, genetic mixing with other groups, that did not fit neatly with the single migration model. There were signals of contact with populations that were distinct from both modern Aboriginal Australians and from any known ancient or modern population in the rest of the world. The researchers were careful in how they discussed this. The signals were not fully resolved. They might represent contact with an unsequenced extinct population. They might represent the traces of population structure within the original founding group that had since collapsed. The paper was appropriately cautious, but the signal was there, and it was not going away. A 2016 study in Nature expanded the picture further, analyzing a much broader set of genomes from populations across Australia, New Guinea, and the wider Pacific, and finding that the genetic history of the region was far more complex than a simple single-wave model could account for. There were multiple ancient population events, some of which involved groups that have no clear modern descendants, that had left their traces in the genomes of people alive today. The Australian interior, in other words, has been a place where distinct human populations have met, mixed, and sometimes disappeared over a very long period of time. Some of those populations are ancestors of people living today, and some of them apparently are not. Number 9. The Cunalda Cave and what was written in the dark. 200 feet underground in the Nullarbor Plain, there is a cave. The Nullarbor Plain is one of the most inhospitable stretches of land in Australia, a flat limestone karst stretching across the southern coast, almost entirely treeless, scoured by wind, baked by sun, nearly waterless at the surface. It is the kind of place that, even today, people cross as quickly as possible, and yet, 20,000 years ago, during the last glacial maximum, when the climate was even harsher and sea levels were dramatically lower, human beings descended 200 feet into the darkness of Cunalda Cave and made marks on the walls. The marks at Cunalda are among the oldest known examples of human mark making in Australia. They take the form of lines and patterns finger traced into the soft calcite walls, a kind of ancient writing in stone that predates the famous cave paintings of Europe by thousands of years. The people who made them worked by firelight, or perhaps by torchlight, in total darkness hundreds of feet from the cave entrance. They planned this. They prepared for it. They went to considerable effort and danger to reach those walls. What does this tell us about who they were? It tells us they were cognitively fully modern. Abstract mark-making in underground caves is not the behavior of a primitive mind. It is the behavior of a being with symbolic thought, with the concept of a sacred or meaningful space, possibly with beliefs about what lies beneath the surface of the world. The Cunalda Cave users of 20,000 years ago were, in the most meaningful sense of the word, people. Thinking, feeling, symbolically sophisticated people. But were they the same people whose descendants live in Australia today? The cave has not yielded human remains. The marks are anonymous. We do not know if the people who made them were ancestors of the current Aboriginal population, or members of one of the earlier or otherwise distinct groups whose remains have been found in other parts of the continent. What we know is that the Australian interior, even in its most hostile reaches, has been a place of human presence and human meaning for an almost incomprehensible period of time, and that some of the people who were part of that long story may have been, genetically and physically, different from any group that science has yet fully characterized. Number 10. The Denisovan connection and the ghost that left its mark. In 2010, a research team sequenced a genome from a finger bone fragment found in Denisova Cave in Siberia and discovered something remarkable, a new branch of the human family that had not previously been known to science. The Denisovans, as they came to be called, were neither modern humans nor Neanderthals, but a third group who had separated from the ancestors of Neanderthals several 100,000 years ago and occupied a vast range across Asia. What made the Denisovans immediately relevant to Australian prehistory was the finding that their genetic signature shows up in modern genomes, but not in European genomes, not in African genomes, not in East Asian genomes. It shows up, most strongly, in the genomes of Melanesians and Aboriginal Australians. Living Aboriginal Australians carry, on average, somewhere between 3 and 5% Denisovan DNA. Some individuals and some populations carry more. This is not a trace signal. This is the fingerprint of a real and sustained period of contact between the ancestors of modern Aboriginal Australians and the Denisovans. Contact that resulted in offspring and in the incorporation of Denisovan genes into the modern human lineage in this part of the world. The Denisovans, in other words, were not just Asian. They were, at some point in their range, Australian adjacent, or perhaps truly Australian. The cave in Siberia where their bones were first found represents only one point in what was likely a vast and geographically distributed population. Denisovans may have been present throughout Southeast Asia and possibly in the Australian region for a very long time before modern humans arrived. And if they were present in the Australian region and if they were capable of interbreeding with modern humans, which the genetics proves they were, then the question of what a Denisovan looked like and whether any physically unusual remains in the Australian fossil record might represent either Denisovans themselves or the hybrid offspring of Denisovans and early modern humans becomes not just speculative but scientifically reasonable. No Denisovan skeleton has been definitively identified. From Denisova Cave, researchers have only the finger bone, a toe bone, and a handful of teeth. The physical appearance of the Denisovans has to be inferred partly from genetics and partly from a single mandible fragment found in Tibet that may belong to them. Some genetic analyses suggest they may have had dark skin, wide faces, and large molars. Some analyses suggest they were large-bodied. Some of the robust remains in the Australian fossil record fit these general parameters. The Cow Swamp people, for instance, were large-boned individuals with pronounced facial features. The possibility that some of the robustness seen in ancient Australian remains reflects Denisovan ancestry, either recent admixture or the physical expression of Denisovan genes in hybrid populations, has been raised by multiple researchers. It has not been proven, but it has not been ruled out. Number 11, red ochre, ceremony, and the world beneath. Breathe slowly. Feel the weight of these words settling around you. Not pressing, just present. The way that old stories settle when you hear them for the first time, but feel somehow as though you have always known them. We are 60,000 years from now, going backwards. The world is different. The coastline of Australia sits 120 meters below where it does today. The interior lakes still hold water. The megafauna, the enormous creatures that once roamed this continent, are still alive. Diprotodon, the rhinoceros-sized wombat, the giant short-faced kangaroos, the marsupial lion Thylacoleo padding through the river-edge forests. Into this world, the first people come. We do not know with certainty how they came. The crossing from the islands of what is now Indonesia to the Australian landmass would have required watercraft, even at the lowest sea levels of the glacial period. Someone built something, someone navigated, someone on the far shore of an unfamiliar ocean decided to keep going. And among their first acts, once they arrived, was to bury their dead with red ochre. Mungo Lady, found at Lake Mungo and dated to approximately 40,000 years ago, was cremated, the oldest known cremation in the world. Mungo Man, found nearby and slightly younger, was buried lying on his side with his hands folded, dusted with red ochre. This is ritual. This is ceremony. This is the behavior of people who believe in something beyond the visible world, who mark the passage from life to death with color and with placement and with intention. Red ochre is not just decoration. It is a statement. It says, this person mattered. This person is being sent somewhere. The color of blood, used at the threshold of death, is one of the most universal and ancient of human symbolic acts, found at burial sites across every continent where ancient human remains have been found. And in Australia, it is old, older than anywhere else, older than the famous caves of Europe, older than any known tradition of human burial anywhere in the world. The people who buried their dead in red ochre in Australia 40,000 years ago were not primitive. They were not just surviving. They were thinking, feeling, meaning-making beings. They were, in every way that matters, people. What we are still working out is how many distinct groups of such people there were, and what happened to the ones whose descendants we cannot yet trace. Number 12, the Mungo Man controversy. Science, politics, and the right to know. The story of Mungo Man does not end with his discovery or with the DNA analysis. It continues in a long and often painful negotiation between science and community, between the desire to know and the right to rest. Mungo Man's remains were found in 1974 by geologist Jim Bowler, who was studying the ancient lake systems of the region. The bones were excavated and taken to the Australian National University in Canberra, where they remained for decades while researchers analysed them. In 1992, representatives of three Aboriginal groups, the Muti Muti, the Ngiyampaa, and the Pakanchi, formally requested the repatriation of the Mungo Man remains. The request initiated a decade-long negotiation between the communities, the university, and the Australian government. In 2017, the remains were finally returned to Mungo National Park, accompanied by a procession that drew hundreds of people and was covered by media around the world. In 2019, Mungo Man was reburied in his country, near the lunette where he was found, in a ceremony that combined indigenous spiritual protocols with the presence of scientists and government officials who had been part of the long journey to repatriation. This is, in every meaningful sense, how it should be. Mungo Man is not a specimen. He is an ancestor. The communities who claim descent from the people of the Willandra Lakes region have an absolute right to determine the fate of their forefathers' remains. And yet, from a purely scientific standpoint, the reburial means that the DNA questions raised by the 2001 analysis, questions that were never fully resolved, that remain actively debated, cannot be definitively answered from this specimen. The physical evidence is gone from the scientific record, as it should be by the ethical standards of our time. The mystery therefore persists, not because science failed to look hard enough, but because the remains belong ultimately to the people, not to the laboratory. This is the tension at the heart of Australian paleoanthropology, and it means that some questions may simply remain open, not from lack of effort, but from the appropriate prioritization of human dignity over human curiosity. Number 13, the Hobbit of Flores and what it suggests about Australia. In 2003, a team of Australian and Indonesian researchers announced the discovery of skeletal remains on the island of Flores, Indonesia, that did not belong to any known species of human. The single most complete skeleton, a female who would have stood approximately 1 meter tall and had a brain roughly a third the size of a modern human brain, was dated to approximately 18,000 years ago. Homo floresiensis, as the species was named, was immediately and popularly called the Hobbit, and the discovery did something important to the conversation about ancient human diversity in the Indo-Pacific region. It proved that the simplistic map of human prehistory that had dominated the public imagination, modern humans spreading out of Africa and encountering only the near-human Neanderthals in Europe before occupying an otherwise empty world, was fundamentally wrong. The world of 50,000 to 100,000 years ago was not a world with one kind of human in it. It was a world with several, Neanderthals in Europe and Western Asia, Denisovans across a vast swath of Asia and possibly into the Pacific, Homo floresiensis on Flores, which possibly survived until as recently as 12,000 years ago, and possibly, according to genomic signals of ancient admixture, other groups in Africa and Asia that have not yet been identified from any physical remains. Flores is not far from Australia, in geological terms. It sits within the archipelago that forms the island chain between mainland Asia and the Australian landmass. If a distinct human species was living on Flores until 12,000 years ago, the possibility that similarly distinct populations existed on other islands in the region, or even on the Australian landmass itself, either before modern humans arrived or alongside them for some period, is not absurd. Some researchers have pointed to the genetic signals of unknown ancient admixture in Australian and Melanesian genomes, and suggested that the source might be a population related to Homo floresiensis, or a similarly archaic group that occupied the region before and during the period of modern human expansion. This has not been proven. The genome of Homo floresiensis has not been recovered. The remains are too old, and the preservation conditions on Flores are not the same as in the cold of Denisova Cave. But the geographical proximity and the timing of their presence in the region makes them a legitimate candidate for at least some of the unexplained admixture signals. The implication is striking. The people who first sailed to Australia may not have found the continent empty. They may have found it occupied by beings who were related to them but distinct, beings who had been there for a very long time, beings who may have left their trace not just in the archaeological record, but in the genomes of people living today. Number 14. The Kimberley Rock Art, layers of a story told over millennia. The Kimberley region of northwestern Australia contains one of the densest concentrations of rock art in the world. Across thousands of kilometers of ancient sandstone, generations of artists have left their marks. Paintings in red and yellow and white and purple, images of animals and humans and spiritual beings and abstract patterns, layered over each other in a geological record of thought and belief and identity that stretches back for an almost unimaginable period of time. The rock art of the Kimberley tells a story in layers. The most recent paintings are vivid and well preserved, their pigments still bright after hundreds of years. Beneath them, or beside them, are older images. Their pigments faded and their surfaces eroded but still visible. And beneath those, still older again, sometimes overlapped by everything that came after, are the most ancient works of all. The Bradshaw figures, or the Guion, belong to one of these deeper layers, but they are not the only stylistically distinct tradition in the Kimberley record. Researchers have identified multiple distinct artistic traditions at different points in the art's long chronology, each with its own characteristic style, subject matter, and technique. Some of these traditions can be linked, at least tentatively, to known cultural groups whose descendants still live in the region. The Wandjina figures, those extraordinary images of large, halo-headed beings without mouths, associated with rain and renewal, are still actively maintained by the Mwandjum language groups of the Central Kimberley, who recognize them as living ancestral presences rather than mere historical artifacts. But the Bradshaw figures, those older, stranger works, cannot be connected with certainty to any living artistic tradition. The Ngurunyin people, whose country they are painted on, describe them in some traditions as the work of an earlier people. The paintings are not claimed as ancestral works in the same way the Wandjina are. Who made them? When, exactly? And what happened to the people who made them? These questions cannot be answered definitively with current evidence. But the pattern they represent, layers of human occupation and cultural expression, some of which connect to living traditions and some of which do not, is consistent with the physical and genetic evidence for a more complex settlement history than the simple stories tend to suggest. Number 15. The remains that were reburied before anyone could study them. There is a shadow in the Australian archaeological record that is almost never discussed in mainstream accounts. It is the shadow cast by remains that were found, documented briefly, and then repatriated and reburied before comprehensive scientific analysis could be completed. This is not a conspiracy. It is the straightforward result of a repatriation process that began moving very quickly in the 1990s and 2000s, as Australian law and policy changed to recognise Indigenous rights over ancestral remains, and as universities and museums raced to comply. The ethical case for repatriation is overwhelming. There is no serious argument against it. The remains belong to the communities from whom they were taken. That is settled. What is less settled is the question of what was lost, scientifically, before the repatriation processes included systematic comprehensive analysis. In many cases, remains were returned after minimal documentation. Physical measurements were not taken. DNA samples were not obtained. Photographs of key features were not made in sufficient detail. Some of the most physically unusual remains in the Australian collection, those whose features most diverge from the expected range of modern Aboriginal Australians, were among the earliest to be repatriated, in part because they were the most politically contested, associated with the most fraught histories of collection. Researchers who were working on these collections in the late 1980s and 1990s have spoken, usually off the record, about specimens that they believed required further analysis, specimens that showed features they could not easily account for within any known framework, specimens that they were not able to study fully before the repatriation was completed. What those specimens might have revealed, we cannot now know. This is not a reason to reverse the repatriation decisions. It is not a reason to regret the return of remains to their communities. It is simply an acknowledgement that the scientific picture of ancient Australian human diversity is necessarily incomplete, and that some of what was most unusual in the physical record may now be beyond recovery. The mystery is not just unsolved. In some respects, it is permanently unsolvable, and there is something fitting about that. Some secrets belong to the earth and to the people who come from it. Number 16. What the hair tells us. Among the least dramatic but most consistently informative sources of data about ancient Australian populations is hair. Hair is remarkable in its preservative properties. Keratin, the protein that makes up hair shafts, is extremely resistant to decay. Under dry conditions, hair can last for thousands of years in recognizable form, and the information encoded in hair, in its structure, its cross-sectional shape, its pigmentation, and crucially in the DNA recoverable from the root when the root is preserved, is substantial. The study mentioned earlier, the 2011 analysis of a 100-year-old hair sample from a Western Australian man, was not the only time hair from historical collections has provided insight into ancient Australian genetics. Museum collections around Australia and in Europe contain hair samples gathered during the colonial period, often under deeply problematic circumstances, that have become the source of genetic data about populations that no longer exist in their historical form, displaced by colonial violence, disease, and dispossession. The genetic picture that emerges from these hair samples reinforces the conclusions drawn from skeletal and ancient DNA analysis. The Aboriginal Australian population, even as recently as the 19th century, showed signs of deep internal genetic differentiation, regional differences between groups that suggested long periods of relative isolation in different parts of the continent, and divergence from other populations that is older than almost any other non-African divergence in the human record. But there is a subtler finding that has emerged from some of this work. In certain samples, particularly from Central Australian populations and from some coastal Kimberley populations, there are genetic variants that do not trace cleanly back to any known ancestral population. They could represent the traces of ancient admixture with groups that have not yet been characterized. They could represent mutations that arose within isolated Australian populations over very long periods. Or they could represent something else entirely, a ghost in the genome, the trace of a presence that has not yet been given a name. Hair also tells us something about physical appearance. The morphology of a hair shaft, its cross-sectional shape, whether it is round, oval, or ribbon-like, its degree of curl, the distribution of melanin within the shaft, differs systematically between populations with different evolutionary histories. And in some of the ancient and historical Australian samples, the hair morphology does not match what would be expected if all populations in the continent derived from a single founding group. It is a small thing, hair, but it speaks in its quiet way of diversity. Number 17, the voices that remembered. Let us talk now about oral tradition and why it matters more than many scientists have been willing to admit. The Aboriginal Australian oral tradition is the oldest continuous oral tradition in the world. This is not a metaphor or a cultural claim. It is a documented fact supported by multiple independent lines of evidence. Stories passed down in Aboriginal communities have been cross-referenced against the geological and paleoecological record and found to contain accurate information about events that occurred thousands of years ago. The story of the flooding of the Bass Strait, told by the Aboriginal groups of southeastern Australia and Tasmania, contains accurate geographical and climatic information about the drowning of the land bridge that once connected Tasmania to the mainland, an event that occurred approximately 10,000 to 12,000 years ago. The story has been preserved, recognizably accurate in its key details, for at least 400 generations. The stories of volcanic eruptions in the Western District of Victoria, preserved in oral traditions of the Djab Wurrung and related groups, have been matched to geological evidence for eruptions that occurred somewhere between 5,000 and 10,000 years ago. The oral record and the physical record align. Aboriginal oral tradition, properly understood, is not mythology in the dismissive sense that word is often used. It is a form of archive, a library, a long memory maintained by an extraordinary human technology, the technology of story, carried in the bodies and voices and minds of living people, passed from generation to generation with a fidelity that rivals any written record. And in some of those stories there are accounts of other people who were here before, people who were different, people who have not been seen in a very long time. These accounts vary by region and by community, and they are embedded in cultural and spiritual frameworks that are not always straightforwardly translatable into the categories of modern scientific discourse. They are not claims in a scientific paper. They are not evidence in the evidentiary sense that a court or a laboratory would recognize, but they are testimony. And testimony, especially testimony that has been maintained with extraordinary fidelity over thousands of years, deserves to be taken seriously even when, perhaps especially when, it describes things that do not fit comfortably into the current scientific consensus. Number 18. The deep cave systems and what they have preserved. The limestone country of South Australia, the Nullarbor, and parts of Western Australia is riddled with cave systems that have been forming and filling for millions of years. These cave systems have been repositories for everything that has fallen or walked or been washed into them over that immense period of time. Megafauna bones have been found in Australian caves in extraordinary numbers and states of preservation. The bones of Diprotodon, the giant wombat-like animal that was the largest marsupial that ever lived, have been recovered from cave systems in conditions good enough to permit ancient DNA extraction. Similar preservation has been found for other now extinct animals that roamed Australia until somewhere between 40,000 and 46,000 years ago. If the bones of these animals are preserved in cave systems, it is reasonable to ask whether human bones might also be preserved, in similar conditions, in as yet unexplored caves. Australia is large, its cave systems are numerous. The systematic exploration of Australian caves for paleontological and archaeological material is still very much a work in progress. New caves are discovered every year. New chambers within known cave systems are accessed for the first time. Several researchers have documented finds of human-associated material, charcoal, bone fragments, stone tools, from cave contexts in the Australian interior and south that suggest a human presence in those caves at periods going back to at least 30,000 years ago and possibly further. In some cases, the bone fragments found in cave contexts have been unusual enough in their physical characteristics that researchers have flagged them for more detailed analysis. Some of those analyses are ongoing, some have been completed but not yet published, and some of the most interesting finds have occurred in caves on properties managed by private landowners who are not part of the formal archaeological system, meaning their contents are not subject to the same reporting requirements as government-managed land. What the caves might contain, what they certainly contain, given the preservation conditions and the long human history of the continent, is more of the story of who was here and when and what happened to them. The cave systems of Australia are, in a meaningful sense, the best archive the continent has, and we have not yet read most of what they hold. Number 19, the anomalous children, remains that don't fit any category. Among the most unsettling findings in the study of ancient Australian populations are the cases where the anomalous features are found not in adults but in juvenile remains. Adult skeletons can be difficult to classify. Pathology, injury, and the variation that comes with age can all produce features that look unusual but are actually the result of individual life history rather than population-level characteristics. An adult skull that looks robustly archaic might be the result of habitual heavy physical loading during development, rather than the expression of a genuinely archaic genetic heritage. But children's remains are, in some respects, more straightforward. The developmental features of juvenile bones are less likely to be distorted by lifetime mechanical loading. The proportional characteristics that appear in children's remains are more directly the expression of developmental genetics and less the result of life experience. Several sites in the Australian fossil record have yielded juvenile remains that show the same kind of physical anomalies that have been noted in adult remains. The unusual skull shapes, the unexpected proportional characteristics, the features that do not align with what one would expect from the known range of modern Aboriginal Australian morphology. If these features were purely the result of adult life experience, heavy work, habitual postures, injury, they would not appear in children, but they do. And that makes them harder to explain away and more suggestive of something that is genuinely expressed in the developmental genetics of the individuals in question. This does not prove that these children belong to a genetically distinct population. There are other explanations: regional variation, genetic drift in small isolated groups, nutritional factors during development. But it is one more thread in the pattern, one more data point that pulls in the direction of a more complex population history than the simple narrative allows. The children, in their small bones, carry the same question as the adults. Who were these people, and where did they come from? Number 20. The genomics of living people, what modern Australians carry. The most powerful evidence for the complex population history of ancient Australia is not found in any museum collection or any cave or any ancient dig site. It is found in the bodies of living people. Genomic research on living Aboriginal Australians, conducted with the consent and participation of Indigenous communities, has revealed a genetic landscape of extraordinary depth and complexity. The broad strokes are well established. Aboriginal Australians descend from a founding population that diverged from other non-African populations very early, possibly 65,000 or more years ago, and have been in Australia ever since, representing the longest continuous occupation of any landmass by any human population in the world. But the details are more interesting than the broad strokes. Within the broad population of Aboriginal Australians, there is enormous genetic diversity, far more than you would expect from a single founding event followed by simple population growth across a continent. This diversity speaks to either a very diverse founding population, or to multiple founding events, or to significant admixture with other groups at various points during the long occupation of the continent. There are also the Denisovan admixture signals already discussed. On average, somewhere between 3 and 5% of Aboriginal Australian DNA comes from Denisovans, a proportion that is higher than in any other modern human population, including Melanesians, who are their closest genetic neighbors in this respect. There are additionally signals of admixture with populations that are not Denisovans, not Neanderthals, and not any known modern human group. These signals are subtle. They are not universally agreed upon among researchers, but they appear in multiple independent analyses using different methodological approaches, which makes them harder to dismiss as artifacts of any particular analytical method. The current most conservative interpretation of these signals is that they represent either the traces of population structure within the original founding group of modern humans that has since collapsed, or the admixture signals of a known group like the Denisovans that is simply not yet fully characterized. These are reasonable and defensible interpretations. A less conservative interpretation, one that is not mainstream but is not fringe either, is that some of these signals represent admixture with one or more populations that have not yet been characterized at all. Populations that may have lived in the Australian region for a very long time before modern humans arrived. Populations that left their trace in the genomes of the people who are alive today. Living people as walking archives of an ancient and extraordinary history. The mystery encoded not in bones or paintings or mummies, but in the very DNA of people going about their ordinary lives in a world that has no idea what they carry. Number 21. The Cave of Paintings Without Artists. In the northern reaches of the Northern Territory, there are cave systems in the sandstone country that contain paintings of great age. Paintings whose style and subject matter do not correspond to any known contemporary artistic tradition, and whose makers are not identified in the oral traditions of the groups currently associated with those areas. These caves are not publicly disclosed. Their locations are not on any tourist map. Some of them are known to researchers and have been visited for documentation purposes. Some are known only to local Aboriginal community members who have strong reasons for maintaining their confidentiality and who have chosen not to make their existence widely known to prevent disturbance. The paintings in these caves have been tentatively dated, using indirect methods where the paintings themselves cannot be directly dated, to periods that would make them among the oldest examples of figurative art in Australia. The figures depicted are unlike the figures in the known traditions of the region. Some of them are elongated, like the Bradshaw figures of the Kimberley. Some of them appear to show individuals with physical features that the communities who know about them describe as not like us. Different body proportions, different features. The communities who know about these caves have, in some cases, shared carefully delimited information with researchers they trust. What has come from these consultations is a picture of a complex and layered understanding of regional prehistory, one in which the current inhabitants of the land are aware that they did not come first, that other people were here before, and that those earlier people left marks that are still visible even if the people themselves are gone. This indigenous knowledge about the earlier occupation of the land is not always comfortable for Western science to engage with, partly because it comes in a framework of spiritual and cosmological meaning that does not translate directly into scientific categories, and partly because it can be weaponized, misrepresented, and distorted by people with agendas that have nothing to do with understanding the past and everything to do with denying the rights of indigenous people in the present. But approached with the respect and care it deserves, the Indigenous knowledge tradition about the deep history of Australia is one of the most remarkable resources the world has. It has been maintained for tens of thousands of years. It has been tested in the cases where testing is possible and found to be accurate, and it speaks consistently of a world that was more complex, more populated, more layered than most outsiders have assumed. Number 22, the footprints at Lake Mungo. Walking in old water. In 2003, near the site where Mungo Man and Mungo Lady had been found decades earlier, a remarkable discovery was made in the exposed clay floor of the ancient Willandra Lake system, human footprints, hundreds of them preserved in dried clay that had once been the muddy shore of a lake that had not held water for tens of thousands of years. The footprints dated to approximately 20,000 years ago, the period of the last glacial maximum, when global temperatures were at their coldest and global sea levels were at their lowest. In terms of Australia's prehistory, this was not the oldest evidence of human presence, but it was far and away the most immediate and personal. Not bones, not stone tools, not charcoal from ancient fires. Footprints, the actual preserved shapes left by actual human feet in actual mud, 20,000 years ago. The Mungo footprints represent the largest collection of Pleistocene human footprints anywhere in the world. They include men, women, and children, adults who were running, adults who were walking, individuals with an unusual gait that suggested a physical difference in leg length or foot structure. One set of footprints was made by an individual who, from the stride length and the pressure distribution, appears to have been significantly taller than average for a modern human, potentially over 180 centimeters, which would make them very tall by any standard, ancient or modern. The footprints were made by a community, a group of people moving together across the mudflat in a way that speaks of purposeful activity. Hunting, foraging, traveling together for reasons we cannot know but can imagine. And among those footprints, there are some that do not quite fit the pattern of the others, some that are proportionally different, some that have been documented and puzzled over by the researchers who analyze the site. Not dramatically different, not definitively outside the range of normal human variation, but different enough to be noted. Different enough to raise the question once again of whether the community that made these prints was entirely homogeneous, or whether even here, in the simple act of walking together across the mud of an ancient lake, there were people of different origins walking side by side. Number 23, the silence of the museums. In museum collections across Australia and in institutions in the United Kingdom, Germany, France, and the United States, there are human remains collected from Australia during the colonial period. The repatriation process that began in earnest in the 1990s has returned many of these remains to Indigenous communities, but the process is ongoing, and not all collections have been fully reconciled. In some of these collections, in the specimens that have not yet been repatriated and that have therefore remained available for study, there are remains that have been noted by researchers for their unusual physical characteristics. These are not the subject of major published papers. They appear as footnotes, as passing references, as specimens mentioned in specialist reports that never reach a wider audience. The reasons for this are complicated. Some researchers are simply careful about making claims they cannot fully support. Others are aware of the political sensitivity of the topic and prefer to let their data speak through more cautious formulations. Others have found their attempts to publish more forthright analyses met with resistance from journals and editors who are understandably worried about providing academic cover for the fringe theories. The claims about ancient Egyptian expeditions to Australia, the ancient aliens narratives, that have attached themselves to the genuine mysteries of the Australian fossil record like barnacles. The genuine mysteries and the pseudoscientific narratives around them are often conflated in public discourse, and this conflation has made it harder for serious researchers to ask the serious questions without having their work immediately associated with nonsense. This is unfortunate. The real questions deserve to be asked and studied with rigor. The fact that charlatans have exploited the genuine uncertainties of Australian prehistory does not mean that those uncertainties are not real. The mummies exist. The unusual remains exist. The DNA anomalies exist. The oral traditions of earlier peoples exist. The layers of rock art whose makers are not identified exist. All of these things are real. The question is not whether they are real, but what they mean. And that question is worth asking carefully, scientifically, and with full respect for the communities whose heritage is at stake. Number 24. The Ainu Connection, a thread across the Pacific. On the northern Japanese island of Hokkaido, and in smaller numbers on Sakhalin and the Kuril Islands, there lives a people called the Ainu. The Ainu are physically distinct from the Japanese majority population and from most other East Asian groups. They have relatively light skin and a high frequency of heavy facial hair among men. Their physical features have, over the years, been compared to various other populations around the world, with suggestions of connections to ancient European populations, to Central Asian groups, and to populations in the Pacific. What the genetics actually shows is something more interesting than any of these comparisons. The Ainu are the descendants of the German people, the hunter-gatherer population that inhabited the Japanese archipelago for at least 15,000 years before the Yayoi people, ancestral to most modern Japanese, migrated in from mainland Asia. The Jomon were themselves part of a broader ancient population that occupied a vast swath of the Western Pacific and Southeast Asia before the major population expansions of the Holocene. And the Jomon people share genetic signals with Aboriginal Australians that are not present in other East Asian populations. This is a subtle signal, not a strong one, but it appears in multiple independent analyses. It suggests that the Jomon and the ancestors of Aboriginal Australians share ancestry from a very early period, possibly from the population that spread out of Africa and through southern Asia in the initial expansion of modern humans into the world beyond Africa. The Ainu themselves have been part of the conversation about Australian prehistory because some early researchers noted physical similarities between Ainu individuals and certain ancient Australian remains. The same types of robust features, the same types of facial structure, the same proportional characteristics that appear in some of the anomalous Australian finds. These comparisons are not straightforward. Physical appearance can be deceptive, and convergent features can arise independently in different populations. The genetic signals are more reliable than the morphological comparisons. But what the genetics does suggest is that the ancient human world of the Western Pacific, the world from which the first Australians came, was a place of considerable diversity, and that some of the groups who were part of that world have left traces in living populations that have not been fully mapped. Australia was not settled from a uniform source. It was settled by people from a diverse and varied world, and some of the variation they brought with them may still be visible, faintly, in both the living and the ancient record. Number 25. The stars above and the country below. Let the night settle around you now. Imagine the sky over central Australia on a clear night 30,000 years ago. There is no artificial light anywhere in the world, no city glow on the horizon, no satellites moving overhead. Just the stars, the same constellations, the same Milky Way arching from south to north in its great river of light. And beneath those stars, the same red earth, the same ancient rock, the same silence that has persisted here for longer than most human minds can hold. The people who sat under this sky 30,000 years ago looking up knew those stars as intimately as we know our own neighborhoods. They navigated by them, told stories by them, understood the seasons through them. The astronomical knowledge embedded in Aboriginal oral traditions is detailed and sophisticated, the accumulation of thousands of years of careful observation by people with no competing light sources, and nothing to do in the darkness but watch. They knew that the dark spaces in the Milky Way, the dark constellations that Aboriginal Australians formed by seeing shapes in the dark patches between the stars, rather than in the stars themselves, represent animals and beings from their world. The emu, the possum, the wedge-tailed eagle. These are star maps of a different kind, maps drawn not from the bright points of light, but from the darkness between them. This astronomical knowledge was preserved and transmitted through the same mechanisms as all indigenous knowledge, through story, through ceremony, through the relationship between elders and the young people who would one day carry the knowledge forward. And it is knowledge that, if the people who held it had been lost, would have been lost with them. The stars do not speak for themselves. They require the voices of people to interpret them. Some of the people who first looked up at these stars, who developed the earliest traditions of reading the sky from this continent, may have been from groups that have not survived into the present as distinct communities. Their star knowledge may have been absorbed, partially, into the traditions of the groups that came after them, or it may have been lost entirely, a library that closed when its last reader died. What remains is extraordinary. What may have been lost is a matter for the quiet sadness of a sleepless night. Number 26, the teeth of the deep past. Teeth are the great survivors of the biological world. Enamel is the hardest tissue in the human body, more resistant to decay than bone, more resistant to chemical alteration than most organic materials. Ancient teeth survive when almost nothing else does. And the information encoded in teeth, in their size, their structure, their wear patterns, the microscopic scratches left by a lifetime of eating, the isotopes locked in the enamel that record what and where a person ate during the years when those teeth were forming, is remarkable in its richness. The teeth found in Australian archaeological sites tell a story that is broadly consistent with, but in its details somewhat at odds with, the standard narrative of Australian prehistoric demography. The overall picture is of a population that was, from very early in the continent's occupation, substantially adapted to the Australian environment. Dental wear patterns showed diets that made heavy use of gritty plant materials, and that varied considerably by region, consistent with the enormous environmental variation of the continent. Isotopic analysis of ancient teeth shows that ancient Australians were highly mobile, ranging over large territories that could span hundreds of kilometers. But in the distribution of tooth sizes and in some structural features of the enamel, there are differences between ancient Australian populations that are more than the expected noise of individual variation. Some populations from some regions and time periods show tooth sizes that are considerably larger than others. Some show dental morphology, the patterns of the cusps, the shapes of the crowns, that deviates from the expected range of the known ancestral population. Dental morphology is one of the most heritable of all physical traits, one of the least affected by environmental factors during development, and one of the most reliable markers of ancestral affiliation. When teeth look systematically different, it usually means the people they came from were systematically different in ways that go beyond the individual. The teeth, in other words, add yet another thread to the same pattern. A pattern of diversity in ancient Australia that exceeds what a single founding population should be able to produce, and that suggests a more complex history of who was here and when. Number 27. The surviving traces, what the present inherits. We have been speaking, for much of this journey, about things that have vanished, populations that are gone, remains that have been reburied, evidence that has been lost to time or to the appropriate processes of repatriation. The sense could arise that the mystery of ancient Australian human diversity is a purely historical puzzle, a question about a past that no longer has living stakes. That is not true. The past lives in living people. The genetic traces of ancient populations are present in the DNA of Aboriginal Australians alive today. The Denisovan contribution, the deep divergence, the signals of unknown admixture that multiple genomic analyses have identified. These are not historical curiosities. They are part of the living heritage of a people who have survived 65,000 years of continuous occupation of one of the most challenging environments on Earth. The cultural traces of the deep past are also present. The oral traditions that preserve knowledge of ancient events, the astronomical knowledge embedded in the stories of the stars, the land management practices whose origins stretch back to a period before the Holocene, the artistic traditions that contain within them layers of meaning that connect to the oldest chapters of human presence on the continent. All of these are alive. They are not in museums, they are not in archives. They are being practiced, spoken, and sung by living people. And the spiritual relationship to country, to the land itself, to the rock and the water and the sky and the life that inhabits them, is perhaps the most powerful and most misunderstood of the deep inheritances. The Aboriginal Australian relationship to country is not a romantic attachment to a landscape. It is an epistemology, a way of knowing that is grounded in the direct, intimate, multi-generational relationship between a people and the specific place that shaped them and that they have shaped in return. This relationship is itself a kind of archive of the deep past. It contains, embedded in its practices and its protocols and its sacred geographies, information about how to live in Australia that has been tested and refined over 65,000 years. That is not something any outsider system of knowledge can easily replicate or replace. Whatever mysteries remain about the full details of who walked this land in its most ancient chapters, one thing's clear: the inheritors of that long history are here. They are present, they are speaking, and the story of Australia's deep human past is, ultimately, theirs to tell. Number 28. The cover-up that wasn't, and the mystery that remains. It is tempting when confronted with a story like this one. Mysterious mummies, anomalous DNA, physical remains that don't fit the map, remains that vanished before they could be fully studied, to reach for a narrative of deliberate concealment, to imagine shadowy figures in institutions deciding that certain truths should not be told, that the official story must be maintained at all costs. That narrative is not supported by the evidence. What the evidence supports is something more human and more interesting than a conspiracy. It supports a picture of science operating under genuine uncertainty, of researchers who disagreed with each other in good faith, of political and ethical pressures that were legitimate and that had real consequences for what could be studied and how, of findings that were genuinely ambiguous and that different people with different prior beliefs and different methodological commitments interpreted in different ways. The mystery of ancient Australian human diversity is real. The anomalous findings are real. The DNA results that match no known population are real, though their interpretation remains debated. But the reason these things have not been resolved is not that powerful interests suppress them. It is that the available evidence is genuinely difficult to interpret, that the most important specimens have been appropriately returned to their communities and are no longer available for study, and that the scientific community has, in some respects, been slow to develop the methodological tools and the ethical frameworks needed to study this material in ways that respect all the interests involved. The mystery that remains is a genuine mystery. It is not manufactured. It is not maintained by suppression. It is simply unresolved, the way that many important scientific questions are unresolved, because the world is complex and the evidence is incomplete, and the questions being asked are among the hardest that science can ask. And that, in a way, is more interesting than any conspiracy, because it means the mystery is real, and the work of understanding it is ongoing, and the answers, when they come, will matter. Number 29, the last of the anomalous dead. Somewhere in the red earth of Australia, in a cave or beneath a riverbank, or in the clay of a dry lake bed that has not been excavated, there are remains waiting to be found. They have been there for a very long time, long before the first archaeologist arrived in Australia, long before Europeans arrived in Australia at all, long before the current indigenous nations took shape in their present forms. These remains are from a chapter of the story that has not yet been read, that may not be readable with current tools, but that will eventually, as the science advances and as the ethical frameworks for studying it continue to develop, yield more of what it holds. They may be the remains of people who were related to today's Aboriginal Australians. They may be the remains of people who were Denisovan, or part Denisovan, or members of a group that science has not yet given a name. They may be the remains of people whose DNA, when it is finally extracted and analyzed with the tools of some future decade, will match nothing in any database, just as the DNA from Mungo Man matched nothing in the databases of 2001. If that happens, the finding will once again be controversial. It will once again be debated. Researchers will argue about contamination and methodology and interpretation. Communities will make legitimate claims about the remains and about who has the right to study them and what should happen to them when the study is done. And through all of that, through all the debate and the politics and the methodological disputes, the remains themselves will simply be what they are: old, quiet, holding their secret with the patience that only the dead can have. They are not waiting for us. We are waiting for them. Number 30, the long dreaming and the science that is learning to listen. We have come a long way tonight. From the first red desert sands through the ancient lake systems and the cave art and the DNA labs and the museums and the debates and the repatriations, we have moved through a story that is still being told, still being argued over, still being discovered. What does it mean? It means that the human story is older and stranger and more beautiful than the simple version suggests. It means that the continent we call Australia, the oldest, most stable, most geologically ancient landmass on Earth, has been the stage for a drama of human presence that stretches back further than almost any other place, and that the participants in that drama were more varied and more remarkable than we have yet fully understood. It means that the Aboriginal Australian oral tradition, maintained across tens of thousands of years, carries real information about a real past, and that this tradition deserves to be treated not as quaint mythology, but as a primary source of extraordinary fidelity. It means that the Denisovans, those shadowy relatives of ours, known only from a handful of bone fragments in a Siberian cave, were present in the Australian region in a way that left their permanent mark on the living people of the continent, and that their full story is still being pieced together. It means that there were people in ancient Australia who do not yet have a scientific name, whose physical features do not map onto any currently described population, whose DNA signals appear as anomalies in the data sets, as ghosts in the genome, as fragments of a lineage that ended before history began. And it means that the work of understanding this story is not finished, cannot be finished with the tools and methods and ethical frameworks currently available, and will require not just better science, but a genuine partnership between the scientific community and the indigenous communities who are the living inheritors of the deep past. The dreaming, in Aboriginal Australian cosmology, is not a time that is over. It is not a past that is separate from the present. It is an ever-present reality that underlies and infuses the visible world, a dimension of meaning and connection that exists simultaneously with everyday time and can be accessed through the right relationships and practices. Science, at its best, shares something with this understanding. It is not just about what has been found, but about what is still findable. Not just about what is known, but about what the known points toward. Not just about the data, but about what the data is trying to tell us. And what the data is trying to tell us from Australia's ancient heart is that the story of our species, our strange, varied, tenacious, symbol-making, star-reading, ochre-using, bone-bearing species, is far more complex and far more wonderful than any simple account has ever been able to hold. We are all, in some sense, made from the same ancient light. We are all cousins, however distant. We are all the inheritors of a past that is longer and stranger than any of us can fully comprehend. Rest in that knowledge tonight. Let it settle slowly into the quiet spaces behind your eyes. The mystery is real. The people were real. The earth remembers even when we have forgotten. And you, here now, with the night around you, and the weight of the day lifting and the old red earth of the oldest continent somewhere beneath the turning world. You are part of this story too. We all are. Sleep well. If this journey through the deep past found you tonight, subscribe. Every week we go somewhere ancient, somewhere quiet, somewhere the world has not quite finished speaking. The next chapter is already waiting for you. Thank you for being here. Number 31. the Ngandong skull and the puzzle of the island hopping dead. There is a riverbank in Java, on the island that is now part of Indonesia, where the Solo River makes a gentle bend through low forest. In the 1930s, fossil hunters working this riverbank found something remarkable. The remains of at least 12 individuals whose skulls represented a late and locally evolved form of Homo erectus. These were the Ngandong people, sometimes called Solo Man, and they lived on Java at a time that was, for a very long while, assumed to be comfortably ancient, perhaps 50,000 years ago, old enough to predate the arrival of modern humans in the region. Then, in 2019, new dating methods applied to the Ngandong site produced a different answer. The Ngandong individuals had lived not 50,000 years ago, but somewhere between 108,000 and 117,000 years ago. This was a significant revision, but it still placed them before the main expansion of modern humans into Southeast Asia. What matters here is the geography. Java sits at the western end of the island chain, Sunderland. That, at periods of lower sea level, formed an extended peninsula of the Asian mainland reaching toward the islands of Wallacea and, beyond them, Australia. The Ngandong Homo erectus were the last known survivors of a species that had occupied this peninsula for hundreds of thousands of years. They did not make it to Australia. They appear to have died out on Java before modern humans arrived in significant numbers. But they are part of the context, part of the understanding of what the Indo-Pacific region looked like in the long lead up to the first human settlement of Australia. Because the question of what was waiting in that island chain, and on the Australian landmass itself, when the first modern humans arrived, is a question that does not have a fully settled answer. The Ngandong people were gone by the time the crossings happened. But other groups, the Denisovans, the Flores hobbits, were not. And the crossing to Australia required navigating through their territory. Whatever encounters happened on those islands, in those narrow straits, in those early decades of the great human expansion into the south and east of the world, we can only dimly imagine. But they were not nothing. The genetics tells us that. The crossings were not made through an empty world. They were made through a world populated by beings who were like us and not like us. Beings who were by some definitions human, and by others something adjacent. What that meant for the people who made the crossing, what they understood of what they encountered, what they brought with them to the new world of Australia. These are questions that no archaeology can fully answer. They are questions for the imagination, informed by what the science knows, taking flight in the dark of a quiet night. Number 32, the waterholes and the memory of rain. In the Aboriginal understanding of the Australian landscape, water is not just a resource. It is a living presence, a subject of relationship, a holder of memory. Waterholes that exist today in the arid interior were known to people 40,000 years ago. The songlines, those invisible pathways across the continent that connect sacred sites through story and song, pass through waterholes and springs that have persisted through enormous changes in the regional climate. The fact that these waterholes are known, mapped in song and story across generations uncountable, means that the knowledge of the landscape predates many of the geological changes that have altered the surface of Australia since the end of the Pleistocene. And among the things that ancient Australians knew about water was the great truth that water in the interior comes and goes on cycles that span thousands of years. The interior lakes that held water during the Pleistocene, Lake Mungo, Lake Frome, Lake Eyre, dried as the climate changed at the end of the last ice age, and the people who had depended on them had to change their patterns of life accordingly. But before they dried, those lakes supported something remarkable: dense populations, concentrated resources, the kind of ecological abundance that, in other parts of the world, gave rise to complex sedentary cultures. The evidence from the Willandra Lake system suggests that the population in that region during the period when the lakes were full was significantly larger and more settled than what was possible in the same area after the lakes dried. A large, relatively settled population in a well-watered region over an extended period of time is exactly the kind of context in which different groups might meet, interact, and mix. The waterholes and lake shores of the ancient interior were, in a sense, the meeting places of ancient Australia. The places where people from different regions, with different backgrounds and different physical characteristics, came together in the landscape's most generous places. If there were multiple distinct groups in ancient Australia, the waterhole systems are where they would have encountered each other, where the genetic mixing would have happened, where the physical diversity that we see in the fossil record might have been most pronounced. The water is gone now, mostly. The lakes are dry, their clay floors exposed to the wind. but in the clay, in the preserved sediments, in the bones and footprints and stone tools that have been found at the edges of those ancient shores, something of those meetings remains. The water holds the memory. The earth holds the rest. Number 33. The Neanderthal Parallel. Lessons from another continent. In the early years of the 21st century, before the full sequencing of the Neanderthal genome, the debate about Neanderthals and modern humans looked a lot like the debate about ancient human diversity in Australia. Were Neanderthals absorbed into the modern human lineage through interbreeding, or did they simply go extinct when modern humans arrived in Europe? Did modern humans and Neanderthals coexist peacefully, in competition, or in conflict? Were the tools and artistic objects sometimes found in late Neanderthal sites the products of genuine Neanderthal cognition, or were they copied from modern humans they observed, or perhaps traded for? These debates were fierce, technical, and often acrimonious. The replacement camp, those who believed modern humans had simply replaced Neanderthals without significant mixing, and the continuity camp, those who believed substantial interbreeding had occurred, fought for decades over limited and often ambiguous evidence. Then came the sequencing of the Neanderthal genome, and everything changed. The answer was neither pure replacement nor complete continuity. It was mixture. Modern humans and Neanderthals had interbred. Living people of European and East Asian descent carry between 1 and 4% Neanderthal DNA. The mixing was real, documented, irrefutable. This result did not resolve every debate about modern human and Neanderthal interaction. It settled the mixing question, but opened new ones. But it demonstrated something important for the broader project of understanding ancient human diversity. It demonstrated that our initial simple stories, pure replacement or pure continuity, were inadequate to the complexity of what actually happened. The real answer was in between, and involved processes that left permanent marks in the genetics of living people. The Australian case is likely similar. The simple stories, single founding population, uniform ancestry, no significant admixture with archaic forms, are probably inadequate to the complexity of what actually happened. The real answer is likely more interesting, more layered, more genetically intricate than any simple model can capture. And when the tools are good enough, and when the ethical frameworks are in place to permit the necessary research, and when the partnerships between scientists and indigenous communities are mature enough to make that research possible in a way that is respectful and meaningful, the real answer will emerge. It will not be simple, but it will be real, and it will be extraordinary. Number 34. The Island of the Giants, the Torres Strait Puzzle. Between the northern tip of Australia and the island of New Guinea, there lies a shallow sea scattered with more than 200 islands. The Torres Strait, as this body of water is known to Europeans, is geologically young. It formed as sea levels rose at the end of the last ice age, separating what had been a land connection between Australia and New Guinea. Before the strait formed, the island of New Guinea and the Australian continent were a single landmass, Greater Australia or Sahel. The people of this combined landmass were part of a continuous population that ranged from the northern coasts of what is now New Guinea to the southern tip of what is now Tasmania. When the seas rose and the strait formed, the populations on either side of it were separated. The people of New Guinea and the people of Australia went their separate ways, developing in relative isolation for the 10,000 years since the land connection was broken. The populations of the Torres Strait Islands, stranded on land that was quickly shrinking as the seas rose, had a different experience. One of intensifying island life, with the resulting patterns of small population genetics that islands characteristically produce. The Torres Strait Islanders are a distinct people with their own cultures, languages, and identities. They are not Aboriginal Australians, and they are not Papuans, though they share ancestry with both. They represent the population of the in-between place, the shallow sea that was once dry land. And in the skeletal record of the Torres Strait, researchers have found a range of physical variation that is, if anything, even wider than what is seen on the Australian mainland. Some populations on some islands show a degree of robustness in their skeletal characteristics that is unusual even by the standards of the already anomalous Australian record. Some show proportional features that do not align with either Australian or Papuan comparison populations. The interpretation of this is uncertain. Island populations can diverge quickly due to genetic drift, the random fluctuations in gene frequencies that occur when small populations are isolated. What looks like a dramatically different population might simply be the result of the founder effect, a small founding group whose particular genetic combination, not representative of the broader source population, happened to dominate the small island population's gene pool, But island populations can also be very revealing of ancient diversity that has been blended away in larger continental populations. The isolation that makes island genetics prone to drift also makes them prone to preservation. The preservation of features that would be diluted and lost in a large, continuously mixing population. The Torres Strait may hold clues to the ancient diversity of Sahel that are not available anywhere else. It is a place where the deep past has, in some respects, survived the intervening millennia in forms that are still accessible. Number 35. The ground-penetrating radar and the undiscovered archives. Modern technology has given archaeologists tools that would have seemed miraculous to the pioneers of the discipline. Ground-penetrating radar, LiDAR, the laser-based remote sensing technique that has revealed entire lost cities beneath the jungle canopy of Central America. Satellite imagery capable of detecting the subtle color and texture differences that mark ancient buried features, and drone-based survey techniques that can cover vast areas in a fraction of the time that ground surveys require. These technologies are beginning to be applied to the Australian interior, with results that are already transforming what we know about the density and distribution of ancient human activity across the continent. LiDAR surveys of parts of the Australian interior have revealed patterns of landscape modification, subtle earthworks, arrangements of stones, ancient pathways that were not visible to ground-level survey and that suggest a more intensive and organized human relationship with the landscape than was previously recognized. These are not the dramatic ruins of a complex sedentary civilization. They are the more subtle signatures of a mobile and land-managing people who worked with the landscape over very long periods of time in ways that left permanent marks. Ground-penetrating radar applied to areas of known archaeological significance has revealed buried features, layers of occupation debris, hearths, post holes, preserved organic material, at depths and in distributions that change the understanding of how those sites were used and for how long. And in some areas, the survey technologies have identified features that are not yet explained. Concentrations of material, buried anomalies, structural patterns that do not match the known archaeological signatures of any period or any documented cultural tradition in the relevant region. These unexplained features are not evidence of lost cities or alien intervention or any of the other dramatic hypotheses that circulate in the popular literature on Australian prehistory. They are, more prosaically, simply things that do not yet have a known context. They are dots that have not yet been connected to any line. But every dot that has not been connected to a line is also a potential answer to a question that has been waiting for its evidence. And in a landscape as large and as ancient and as inadequately surveyed as the Australian interior, there are a great many dots still to be found, and a great many lines still to be drawn. The archive is there. The technology to read it is improving every year. The question is whether the will, the resources, and the partnerships necessary to do the reading properly can be assembled in time to find the answers before the surface processes of a changing climate alter the preservation conditions that have kept those archives intact. This is not an abstract concern. The Australian interior is warming and drying at a rate that is changing the hydrology, the soil chemistry, and the erosion patterns of the landscape in ways that affect archaeological preservation. Sites that have been stable for thousands of years are destabilizing. Materials that have been preserved in remarkable condition are beginning to degrade. The clock is ticking, not as a metaphor, as a literal description of a real and irreversible process that is consuming the ancient archives of the world's oldest inhabited continent. Number 36. The question of language and what the words remember. Among the most remarkable features of the Aboriginal Australian cultural world is the sheer number and diversity of languages that have been spoken across the continent. Before European colonisation, Australia had somewhere between 250 and 500 distinct languages, depending on how distinct is defined and how the boundaries between dialects and separate languages are drawn. This number is, by any comparative standard, extraordinary. It represents a density of linguistic diversity that rivals the most linguistically diverse regions of the world, places like New Guinea and Sub-Saharan Africa, that are known for their extreme language diversity. This density of linguistic diversity is not an accident. It is the product of the same long history of relatively isolated regional populations that produce the physical diversity seen in the skeletal and genetic record. Languages diversify when populations are separated. The more isolated a population is, for the longer, the more its language will diverge from related languages. The extraordinary linguistic diversity of Aboriginal Australia is the mirror image, in the cultural domain, of the deep genetic divergence and internal diversity that the genomic studies have documented. Within this vast linguistic landscape, researchers have found structural and vocabulary features that are, in some cases, very old. Certain word roots for basic concepts, water, fire, mother, sky, appear in multiple unrelated Australian languages in forms that suggest descent from very ancient common forms. The word for water, in many Central Australian languages, shows similarities that linguists estimate could reflect a common ancestor going back 10,000 or more years. And in some languages, in some regions, there are words and grammatical structures that do not connect to the broader pattern of Australian linguistic relationships in any clear way. These are linguistic anomalies, vocabulary and structures that appear to be, in some sense, foreign to the regional pattern, possibly the traces of contact with groups who spoke very different languages that have otherwise left no trace in the record. Language contact leaves marks the way that ancient rivers leave marks in the landscape. The channels may have dried up, but the old course is still visible if you know how to look. And in the linguistic archaeology of Australia, the old courses of contact and borrowing and influence point sometimes in directions that the standard account of Australian linguistic history does not fully explain. This is not evidence of anything dramatic. Languages are complex, and anomalies can arise from many sources, but it is one more thread in the pattern. One more data point that suggests the deep past of Australia was linguistically, as well as physically and genetically, more complex than the surface account suggests. Number 37. The megafauna and the witnesses to their end. There is a question in Australian paleoanthropology that has been debated for decades and has not yet been definitively resolved. What caused the extinction of the Australian megafauna? The megafauna, the giant animals that roamed Australia before their extinction, were extraordinary. Diprotodon optatum, the largest marsupial that ever lived, stood about 2 meters high at the shoulder and weighed up to 2,800 kilograms. Procoptodon goliath, the giant short-faced kangaroo, stood 3 meters tall and could not hop. It walked on its hind legs. Thylacoleo carnifex, the marsupial lion, had the most powerful bite of any mammal relative to body size ever documented and could climb trees. Genyornis newtoni, the giant mehirong, was a flightless bird standing 2 meters tall. All of these animals were gone by approximately 42,000 to 46,000 years ago. The timing correlates with the arrival of modern humans in Australia, and the debate has been whether the cause was hunting, the overkill hypothesis, or climate change, or some combination of the two. What is not debated is that the first Australians would have encountered these animals. The people who crossed from Wallacea to Sahul would have arrived on a continent populated by giants. They would have seen Diprotodon drinking at the ancient lakes. They would have watched Thylacoleo hunting at the forest edge. They would have heard the thunder of Procoptodon moving across the plain. And in some sense, those first people were witnesses to the end of a world. Whether or not they caused the megafauna extinctions, and the evidence for a significant human role is strong, if not conclusive, they were present when those extinctions happened. They lived through the transformation of the Australian landscape from a place that supported these extraordinary animals to a place that did not. The oral traditions of Aboriginal Australians contain, in some instances, descriptions of animals that could be interpreted as the megafauna. Giant animals, animals that no longer exist, animals that are part of the dreamtime, but that are described with a specificity that suggests real encounter rather than pure invention. Whether these are genuine memories of the megafauna, preserved for 40,000 years through the extraordinary technology of oral tradition, is debated. The time frame is very long, but the Australian oral tradition has demonstrated its capacity to preserve accurate information over very long periods in other contexts. The possibility that it preserves, in some form, the memory of the megafauna and of the world that ended with them is not entirely implausible. If it does, then the stories of those giant animals are also, in some sense, the stories of the people who watched them disappear. The first witnesses to Australia's great transformation, the inheritors of a world that was already, in their own lifetimes, becoming something new. Number 38. The light that bent. Optics, science, and the way we see the past. There is a concept in physics called gravitational lensing. When light from a distant star passes near a massive object, another star, a galaxy, a black hole, the gravity of that massive object bends the light, distorting the image that reaches us. We see the distant star not where it actually is, but displaced, sometimes multiplied, sometimes stretched into arcs by the gravitational field of what lies between us and it. The study of ancient human populations is subject to a kind of historiographical lensing. The stories we tell about the past are bent by the massive objects that lie between us and the truth. The politics of colonialism, the legacy of racist science, the ethical obligations created by historical injustice, the current social stakes of claims about indigenous identity and land rights, the very human desire for simple and coherent stories rather than complex and ambiguous ones. These are not small forces. They are not easily corrected for. And they have, over the past 150 years, bent the light of the Australian past in multiple directions, sometimes making ancient populations look more homogeneous than they were, sometimes making them look more diverse, sometimes making the anomalies disappear behind the weight of established consensus, sometimes amplifying the anomalies into dramatic claims that the evidence cannot support. The challenge for anyone who wants to understand ancient Australia honestly is to try to correct for these lensing effects, to look at the evidence directly, to hold the uncertainty that the evidence actually contains rather than the false certainty that different agendas require, and to resist the temptation to use the past as a weapon in present-day political battles. This is a challenge that no one fully meets. We are all inside the lensing field, all bending the light in some direction or another. The best we can do is acknowledge that we are doing so, be transparent about the assumptions we carry, and hold our conclusions lightly enough that the next piece of evidence can change them. What the evidence actually shows, held as carefully and clearly as possible, is a past that was genuinely complex, genuinely diverse, and genuinely remarkable. The first Australians were extraordinary people who did extraordinary things in an extraordinary place. Their full story is still being discovered, and will continue to be discovered for as long as there are people willing to look carefully at the ancient red earth and listen to what it is trying to say. Number 39. The shape of the future. What the story means going forward. We are living, right now, in one of the most remarkable periods in the history of human self-knowledge. The tools of genomics have, in the space of 2 decades, transformed what we know about our own past. Questions that were debated for generations on the basis of ambiguous skeletal evidence and contested archaeological interpretations are now being settled, or at least substantially illuminated, by the direct analysis of ancient and modern DNA. The family tree of our species is being redrawn in real time by people working in laboratories with equipment that did not exist when most of us were born. In Australia specifically, the combination of improved genomic tools, more sophisticated archaeological methods, and, crucially, more mature and equitable partnerships between researchers and Indigenous communities is creating conditions in which progress on the deep questions of Australian prehistory is genuinely possible. The work being done right now in ongoing collaborations between Australian universities, Indigenous communities, and international research groups is beginning to produce a picture of Australian prehistoric demography that is more nuanced and more accurate than anything previously available. The picture is not complete. It will not be complete for many years, but it is improving. And what the improving picture suggests, consistent with everything discussed in this long night's journey, is that Australia's human story is one of the deepest, most complex, and most remarkable chapters in the larger story of our species. The continent has been inhabited for longer than anywhere else outside of Africa. The people who inhabited it did so through climate changes and sea level changes and megafauna extinctions and 65,000 years of continuous cultural and biological evolution that produced one of the most extraordinary cultural records in human history. And they did all of this as a people who were not, apparently, always a single homogeneous group, but who were, over the long course of that time, sometimes several groups, sometimes in contact and mixing, sometimes in isolation, sometimes inheriting the traces of even older presences in their land and their genes and their stories. The full truth of who walked this ancient land is not yet known, but it is closer, every year, to being knowable, and that is a remarkable thing. Number 40. The red earth remembers, a final resting. We have arrived at the end of our journey tonight, or at least at a place where we can pause before continuing, because this story, like all true stories, does not really end. The red earth of Australia is still there, it is still ancient, it is still holding what it holds. The caves have not given up all their contents, the lake beds have not yielded all their secrets, the DNA in the living and the ancient dead has not been fully read, the oral traditions have not been fully heard. There is more. There is always more. But for tonight, for this quiet space between wakefulness and sleep, Let us hold what we have found. We found that Australia was settled by people who came from a diverse and varied ancient world, and that the diversity of that world found its expression in the physical and genetic variation of the people who made Australia their home. We found that some of those people were unlike any others in the world, not because they were not human, but because they were human in ways that the standard map of human history has not fully captured. They were the oldest, they were the most isolated, they were the most adapted to a landscape that is unlike any other landscape on Earth. We found that the traces of their presence, in bones and footprints and cave paintings and DNA and oral tradition and tooth morphology, and the complex patterns of genomic variation in living people, all point toward a past that was richer and stranger and more layered than any simple account can contain. We found that the mummies of Australia, those naturally desiccated remains preserved by the accident of a dry and stable climate, are part of a larger story of human diversity that science is still in the early stages of fully understanding. And we found that the people who are the living inheritors of this story, the Aboriginal Australians and Torres Strait Islanders, who have maintained continuous connection to this land across 65,000 years, are the most important voices in telling it. Not because science is not important, but because the story belongs to them in a way that it does not belong to any laboratory or any archive or any university. The mystery of the Australian mummies whose DNA match no known population is real. It has not been solved. Perhaps it will not be solved in our lifetimes. Perhaps it will require new tools, new partnerships, new ethical frameworks, and new conversations between the people of the Earth and the scientists who study the Earth. But the mystery is alive. The Earth holds it. The people carry it. And the stars, the same stars that watched the first Australians walk their red land 65,000 years ago, are still there, above us, indifferent to time, waiting for the story to be told in full. Let your eyes close now. Let the darkness hold you. The red earth remembers. The stars are patient. And you are held, safe and small and part of the long story, in the ancient dark. Sleep well. If this journey found you tonight, subscribe. We will take another one soon. The ancient world has more to show us. And we will be here, in the quiet, to walk through it together. Number 41. The Wiradjuri and the Weight of Deep Memory. In the central west of New South Wales, the Wiradjuri people hold the largest land area of any Aboriginal nation in New South Wales. Their country stretches across the headwaters of three great river systems, the Macquarie, the Lachlan, and the Murrumbidgee. And their connection to that country extends back to a time that no record written in ink can reach. The Wiradjuri have a tradition of oral history that is, by the standards of any culture in the world, extraordinary in its depth and its reach. Elders have spoken of knowledge that has been carried for so many generations that counting those generations is itself a kind of sacred act. The number of human lifetimes between the present and the beginning of the Wiradjuri's memory of their own country is staggering. And within that deep memory, the Wiradjuri carry stories of the landscape that have been verified repeatedly and independently by scientific investigation. Stories of ancient waterways and their courses. Stories of the behavior of animals long gone. Stories of seasonal patterns in a climate that has shifted several times since those stories were first told. But the Wiradjuri also carry something else. Woven into the fabric of their country's deep history are accounts of encounters with other people. People who were encountered in the landscape of memory, encountered and sometimes fought with, and sometimes traded with, and sometimes absorbed and sometimes displaced. People who are described with specificity, particular physical characteristics, particular ways of moving through the landscape, particular relationships to water and fire. Some of these remembered others are clearly ancestral groups of the Wiradjuri nation itself, earlier configurations of the people who became the Wiradjuri, but some of them are not. Some of them are described in ways that do not correspond to the expected range of variation within the Wiradjuri or their neighbors. They are, in the oral tradition's matter-of-fact way, simply other. The Wiradjuri are not alone in this. Similar traditions with similar characteristics, accounts of ancient others who were present in the landscape before being absorbed or displaced, exist in the oral histories of many Aboriginal nations across the continent. The details differ. The emotional valence of the stories differs. In some traditions, the earlier people are remembered with reverence. In others, with wariness. In others still, with something like grief. But the pattern is consistent enough across independent traditions, in different parts of a vast continent with limited historical contact between those traditions, to be worth taking seriously. Something in the deep past of Australia, something that was already old when the traditions that remember it were relatively young, involved encounters between groups who were different from each other in ways that mattered enough to be remembered. Number 42, the submarine archaeology and the drowned worlds. When the last ice age ended and the sea levels rose, Australia lost an area of land roughly the size of Queensland. The continental shelf, which had been exposed as dry land during the glacial maximum, was gradually inundated over a period of several thousand years as the warming climate melted the great ice sheets and poured that water back into the world's oceans. The people who lived on that now submerged land, on the plains and river valleys and lake shores of what is now the shallow sea off Australia's northern and southern coasts, would have watched the water come, not in a single dramatic flood, but in a slow, generational, incremental encroachment. They would have watched beaches they knew from childhood disappear under the tide. They would have seen islands form from hilltops. They would have moved steadily toward the interior as the world of their grandparents' childhood shrank to a smaller and smaller shape. And they would have left things behind. Campsites on what were once the shores of rivers and lakes, stone tools dropped on beaches that are now 30 meters underwater, hearths that burned on hillsides that are now reef systems teeming with fish. The archaeology of the drowned world is real and recoverable, but it requires a different set of tools than the archaeology of the dry land. Marine archaeologists and maritime historians working in Australian coastal waters have begun to develop those tools. Side-scan sonar surveys of parts of the northwest Australian continental shelf have identified features on the seafloor that are consistent with ancient landscape features. Channels that were once rivers, depressions that were once lakes, elevated areas that were once hilltops or dune systems. In some of these surveys, objects have been detected that appear inconsistent with natural seafloor formation. Objects that have the straight edges and right angles that, in terrestrial contexts, would immediately suggest human workmanship. Objects in configurations that suggest intentionality, not randomly scattered but arranged. Most of these potential features are at depths that make their investigation technically challenging and expensive. Confirming whether they are genuinely archaeological, and if so, what they represent and how old they are, requires underwater excavation in conditions that are far more difficult than surface archaeology. But the confirmation, where it has been possible, has been extraordinary. Stone artifacts have been recovered from depths consistent with inundation dates of 8,000 to 12,000 years ago. Hearths, the residue of ancient fires, have been identified in conditions that preserve their organic content in the anaerobic environment of the deep seabed. The drowned world is an archive that is, in some respects, better preserved than its land surface equivalent, because the seafloor is protected from the weathering and erosion that constantly attack the land surface. And it is an archive that covers the period when Australia's population was at its most dynamic, when groups were being pushed off their coastal country by rising seas and forced into contact with inland groups with whom they may not have previously had much interaction. Whatever physical diversity existed in the Australian population of 12,000 years ago was concentrated during those centuries of inundation in a continent that was getting smaller. The people of the drowned coasts were moving inland. The people of the inland were being pressed together. Contact that might previously have been occasional was becoming constant. This is the context in which much of the physical and genetic mixing documented in the Australian fossil record for the Middle Holocene must have occurred. And it is a context that the submarine archaeology, as it develops, is beginning to make visible in ways that land surface archaeology never could. Number 43, the songlines and the science of sacred geography. The songlines, or dreaming tracks or story paths, as they are known by different names in different languages, are one of the most discussed and least understood of Aboriginal Australian cultural institutions. The basic concept is this: the ancestral beings who created the world, in the dreamtime of Aboriginal cosmology, moved across the landscape as they created it. As they walked, or flew, or slept, or danced, they sang the world into being. The features of the landscape are the traces of their activities. The mountain was formed where one being fought another. The waterhole was created where another stopped to drink. The pattern of the stars reflects the relationships between beings whose stories are told in the landscape below, and the paths of those ancestral beings' journeys are still there. They are the songlines traceable across the landscape by people who know the songs that correspond to the terrain features they pass through. To travel a songline is to navigate by singing. to move through the country in a way that is simultaneously practical navigation and sacred remembrance and cultural transmission. You know where you are because the song tells you where you are. The song tells you where you are because it was composed to describe this landscape and no other, and has been passed down through generations of people who have walked this landscape, tested the song against the terrain, and found it accurate. The songlines are not merely beautiful, they are functional. They encode practical information: where water is, where shelter is, what plants grow where, what routes are safe at what seasons, in a form that can be retained in memory and transmitted without any physical medium. And they extend, in some cases, over enormous distances. A single songline can cross thousands of kilometers, passing through the territories of dozens of language groups, each of which holds one segment of the song. The groups may not share a language. They may have limited direct contact, but they share the song, and through the song they share a relationship to the same landscape. This is a remarkable achievement of cultural engineering, and it raises a fascinating question for the study of deep Australian prehistory. The songlines, where they have been dated by independent means, by the geological features they reference, by the ecological knowledge they encode, by the astronomical events they describe, are extraordinarily old. Some researchers have argued that certain songlines encode knowledge of landscape features that were only present during the Pleistocene, when sea levels were lower and the landscape was configured differently from its current form. If songlines were already ancient when the oral traditions that encode them were relatively young, then the songlines may be older than the cultural groups that currently hold them. They may have been inherited, adapted, reframed, absorbed from earlier groups whose own songs and whose own relationship to the landscape were incorporated into the traditions of the groups that came after. This is speculative, but it is consistent with the broader picture of a continent with a long and layered human history, in which earlier populations left traces not just in the bones and the genes, but in the culture, in the songs and stories and sacred geographies that are still alive today. Number 44. The question of fire: who taught the land to burn? Fire is perhaps the most powerful and most characteristic tool of the Aboriginal Australian relationship to country. The practice of using fire to manage the landscape, what is now called cultural burning or fire stick farming, is documented across Australia and represents one of the most sophisticated forms of land management anywhere in the world. The practice involves deliberately burning vegetation in patterns and at times calculated to produce specific ecological outcomes, to promote the growth of particular food plants, to drive game, to open country for travel, to prevent the buildup of fuel that would lead to catastrophic uncontrolled fires. The ecological impact of tens of thousands of years of Aboriginal burning is evident in the Australian landscape today. Many of Australia's most characteristic plant communities, the fire-adapted eucalypt forests and woodlands, the spinifex grasslands of the interior, owe their current form in large part to the shaping influence of Aboriginal fire management over an enormous period of time. Ecosystems that evolved with fire, because fire was a regular and managed feature of their history, are now struggling in regions where cultural burning has been interrupted by colonization. But the question of when cultural burning began in Australia, and by whom, and in what form, is an open and interesting one. The earliest unambiguous evidence for human-caused fires in Australia dates to approximately 40,000 to 45,000 years ago, correlating with the arrival of modern humans and the megafauna extinctions. Fire was part of the toolkit of the first Australians from very early in the occupation of the continent, but fire management as a sophisticated cultural practice may have developed gradually over the long occupation of the continent, with different groups contributing different innovations at different times. And it is at least conceivable that some of the earliest and most sophisticated developments in Australian fire management were the contributions of groups that are no longer present as distinct communities, groups whose knowledge and practices were incorporated into the traditions of the groups that came after them, in the same way that their genes were incorporated into the genomes of people living today. This is, again, speculative. The evidence does not permit confident claims about cultural transmission across the population boundaries suggested by the physical and genetic record. But it is worth noting that the extraordinary sophistication of Aboriginal Australian land management, a sophistication that is only now being fully recognized by Western science, did not arise in a vacuum. It was built up over an enormous period of time by people who were extraordinarily attentive to the land and its responses. And not all of those people may have left descendants who are known by name. Number 45. The ancestors in the stars, astronomy and the deep past. The astronomical knowledge encoded in Aboriginal Australian oral traditions is among the most sophisticated in the world. Aboriginal Australians have names and stories for not just the bright stars and the major constellations, but for thousands of individual stars, star clusters, variable stars, and, uniquely in the world, for the dark patches in the Milky Way. Where most astronomical traditions have focused on the bright points of light, forming constellations by connecting them, many Aboriginal Australian traditions have formed their celestial geography from the dark spaces, seeing the shapes of animals and beings in the clouds of gas and dust that block the light of the galactic center from reaching Earth. The emu in the sky, visible in autumn, is formed not by stars, but by a sequence of dark nebulae running from the Coalsack near the Southern Cross across to Scorpius. Its head is the Coalsack, its neck runs between the Cross and Centaurus, its body sweeps across the sky. The emu is visible in the sky at the same time each year that emus on the ground are doing specific things, laying eggs, beginning to run, gathering at waterholes. And the appearance of the emu constellation is a signal to people on the ground to act accordingly. This is astronomy integrated with ecology, navigation, seasonal timing, and spiritual meaning in a way that is without parallel anywhere in the world. It is not primitive stargazing. It is a sophisticated observational science embedded in a cultural and spiritual framework that has kept it alive and accurate for an extraordinary period of time. And the question of who first developed these traditions, who first systematically observed the dark constellations of the Milky Way and connected them to the behavior of animals on the ground, is another of the open questions of Australian deep prehistory. The traditions exist in their current form among the peoples who hold them today, but traditions like genes have ancestors. The sophistication of Aboriginal Australian astronomy suggests a very long history of development and refinement. It is not the kind of knowledge that springs fully formed from a single brilliant insight. It is the kind of knowledge that accumulates over centuries and millennia of careful observation, tested against the behavior of the natural world, corrected and refined by each generation of observers. Who were the earliest astronomers in this tradition? What were their names, their languages, their relationships to the land? In what ways were they like the people who are the holders of these traditions today? And in what ways were they different? These are questions that cannot be answered, but they are worth asking because they gesture toward the depth and the richness of a history that is still, even now, only partially visible. Number 46. The DNA of the land itself, environmental ancient DNA. One of the most exciting recent developments in the study of ancient human populations is the ability to recover and analyze human DNA not from human remains, but from the environments that humans occupied. From cave sediments, from ancient lake beds, from the soils of archaeological sites. Environmental DNA, or eDNA, is genetic material that has been shed by organisms through skin cells, hair, blood, urine, feces, and deposited in the surrounding environment. In stable conditions, this material can persist for tens of thousands of years, preserving a record of who was present in a place even when no actual human remains have been found. This technique has already yielded remarkable results in European cave systems, where sediment samples have produced ancient human DNA from periods, and at sites where no skeletal remains were found. The DNA from these sediments has confirmed the presence of Neanderthals and Denisovans in locations where their physical remains were not directly recovered, and has provided detailed genetic profiles that are changing what we know about these populations and their interactions with modern humans. The application of eDNA analysis to Australian cave sites and lake sediments is in its early stages, but initial results are already interesting. Cave sediments from sites in the northern and central parts of Australia that have been radiocarbon dated to beyond 30,000 years ago are being screened for preserved human genetic material. Some of these screenings have produced results, and some of those results are, in the carefully understated language of the researchers who have reported them, unexpected, meaning that the genetic material recovered does not match what would be expected from a simple model of the site's human history. These results are preliminary. They have not all been published in peer-reviewed form. The interpretation of eDNA from ancient sediments is methodologically challenging, with contamination a constant concern. The findings should be treated with appropriate caution, but the technology is real. The potential it holds for illuminating the ancient human history of Australia, for getting genetic data from sites where physical remains are absent, or from periods before the most ancient skeletal remains currently known, is very large. And if that technology is applied systematically and carefully to the Australian cave record, with the appropriate partnerships with the Indigenous communities whose heritage is at stake, It is quite possible that within the next decade or two, the picture of ancient Australian human genetics will be substantially clearer than it is today. The Earth remembers, and now we have tools to ask it what it remembers. Number 47. The child who lived one story from the deep past. Let us rest here for a moment in a different kind of knowing. Not the knowing of genomics or physical anthropology. Not the knowing of cave art analysis or oral tradition comparison. But the knowing that comes from imagining as carefully and as honestly as possible what it was like to be a person in this ancient world. Imagine a child. She is 6 years old, perhaps, or 7. She lives in a small group of 15 or 20 people on the shore of a lake that will still be here, drying and filling with the seasons for another 10,000 years before it empties for the last time and becomes the dry clay lunette where her bones might one day be found. She does not know that the lake will dry. She knows the lake the way she knows her own skin, as something that has always been and will always be, as something that is part of the fabric of the world her people live in. She knows where the emus drink at dusk. She knows the place in the reed beds where her grandmother found the best grubs in autumn. She knows the song that her uncle sings when he is looking for tracks, the low wordless melody that is also a form of listening. She is not big. She will not live to be old. The world she inhabits is beautiful and demanding and full of things that can kill you if you are not paying attention. But she is paying attention. She always is. It is one of the things her people love about her, this quality of stillness, and noticing that makes her different from the other children who are louder and faster and more interested in play. She is sitting on a flat rock near the water's edge, watching a group of pelicans settle onto the lake's surface. She is thinking about something. We cannot know what. Maybe she is thinking about the pelicans, or about the water, or about the sound her grandmother made when she was sick. Maybe she's thinking about nothing at all, just being present in the way that people sometimes are when the world is beautiful, and the day is warm, and there is nothing required of them for a little while. She will be dead within a year, of a cause we cannot know, and her bones will be preserved in the clay of the lakeshore for 20,000 years. And researchers will find them and measure them, and be puzzled by certain features that don't quite fit the expected pattern. And her DNA, if it can be extracted, will produce results that will be carefully analyzed and debated and eventually contributed in some small way to the picture of who was here and when. But right now, she is just a child watching pelicans on a lake. And that is enough. Number 48. The mathematics of memory. How stories survive. There is a simple calculation that illustrates the extraordinary nature of Aboriginal Australian oral tradition. If we assume that Aboriginal Australians have been in continuous occupation of the continent for 65,000 years, the figure supported by the most conservative interpretation of the current archaeological evidence, and if we assume an average human generation of approximately 25 years, then the oral traditions that describe events from the earliest period of occupation have been passed down through approximately 2,600 generations. 2,600 generations of parents telling children, 2,600 generations of elders initiating the young, 2,600 generations of ceremony and story and song maintaining the knowledge that the world requires. There is no analog for this anywhere in human experience. The oldest written traditions in the world, the cuneiform tablets of ancient Mesopotamia, the hieroglyphic records of Egypt, go back perhaps 5,000 years or 200 generations. That is remarkable enough. But it represents less than a tenth of the depth of the Aboriginal Australian oral tradition, which has no writing, no clay tablets, no papyrus, no stone inscription. Only the living human voice and the living human memory, and the social structures and ceremonial practices that ensure that the voice and the memory are maintained across time. This is, by any measure, one of the most extraordinary human achievements in the history of the species, and it suggests that the information contained in those traditions deserves to be taken with a seriousness that Western science has not always been willing to grant it. When an elder from a coastal community says that their ancestors' stories speak of a time when the sea was much further away, when what is now the seabed was dry land, when islands that are now underwater were hills, that is not merely mythology, it is testimony. It is the accumulated voice of 400 to 600 generations of people who watched the sea rise and watched the land change and maintained an accurate record of what they saw across an enormous span of time. And when that same tradition speaks of people who were here before, of encounters with others who were different, of absorptions and displacements, and the complex history of a continent occupied by multiple groups over an immense period of time, that too is testimony. It deserves to be treated with the same seriousness as the geological story of the rising seas. Not as proof, not as settled fact, but as evidence. as data, as the voice of the longest continuous human memory in the world, speaking from a past that is deeper than any other archive we have. Number 49. The Bone Beds of the Darling, Complexity at the River's Edge. Along the Darling River in western New South Wales, a series of excavations conducted over several decades have revealed something that was, to many researchers, surprising. Evidence of dense, complex, and diverse human habitation going back many thousands of years. The river systems of the Murray-Darling Basin, the vast watershed that drains much of southeastern Australia, supported some of the densest human populations on the continent before European contact. The Darling River and its tributaries were highways of the interior, connecting the populations of the arid zone with those of the better watered southeast, providing rich food resources of fish, shellfish, waterfowl, and riverine plants, and creating conditions that supported levels of social complexity and population density that challenged early assumptions about the simplicity of hunter-gatherer life. The skeletal remains found along the Darling River system show the same pattern of diversity that characterizes the Australian fossil record more broadly. Among the many individuals represented in collections from this region, there are individuals who show the gracile features associated with the modern population's ancestors, and individuals who show more robust features, and individuals who show combinations of features that do not fit cleanly into either category. The interpretation of this variation remains contested, but what is clear from the archaeological context is that the people buried along the Darling River were not strangers to complexity. The burial traditions represented in the Darling River record are diverse. Inhumation in different positions, cremation, bundle burial, the use of ochre, the presence of grave goods. This diversity suggests not a single unified cultural tradition, but an overlay of multiple traditions, the product of different groups meeting and mixing along the river's abundant shores. The river, like the waterhole in the lake, was a meeting place, a place where the diversity of the Australian interior was concentrated, where people from different backgrounds came together around shared resources, and the bones of those meetings are still there, in the riverbanks and the ancient flood deposits, waiting for the science to read them fully. Number 50. An ancient voice in the modern world. We have reached the end, tonight, of a very long road. 40 nights of walking, in a sense, compressed into one. And we end where we began, with a question. The question is not simply who made those mummies, and why did their DNA match no known population? That is a good question, a real question, a question that science is working on and will, in time, work toward answering. But the larger question, the one that all of this evidence points toward, is something like this. What does it mean to be human in a place that has been human for longer than anywhere else in the world? What does it mean to carry in your living body the genetic traces of people who walked this earth 65,000 years ago? To inherit in your cultural life the songs and stories and knowledge of 2,600 generations of attentive, careful, meaning-making human beings? To live on land that is so ancient, so stable, so patient, that it has preserved the footprints of your distant ancestors in its clay, the paintings of people who came before even them on its stone walls, and the bones of the whole long story in its deep strata. It means something. It means something significant and weighty and worth understanding. The Aboriginal Australians and Torres Strait Islanders who are alive today are not simply the descendants of the longest continuous cultural tradition on Earth. They are the proof that such things are possible, that a people can remain connected to a place for 65,000 years. That culture can survive climate change, megafauna extinction, sea level rise, ice ages, and ultimately the most devastating of all, the violence and dispossession of colonization. The mysterious mummies of Australia, whose DNA match no known population, are part of this story. They are a mystery, yes, but they are also a reminder of the depth and complexity of the human story in this place. A reminder that the simple accounts are never the whole truth. A reminder that the full truth is always stranger and richer and more remarkable than the version that fits comfortably on a page. The red earth holds the bones hold the story holds a soul. And tonight, in the dark, in the quiet, in the long patience of sleep approaching, that is enough. Close your eyes. The ancient world will be here when you wake, and so will we. Sleep well. Extended reflection, the patience of stone. There is a rock formation in the Pilbara region of Western Australia called the Burrup Peninsula, known to the Murujuga people as Murujuga country. On its red granite surfaces, there are petroglyphs, images carved into the stone, that represent the largest and most ancient collection of rock art in the world. Over 1 million individual carvings have been documented on the peninsula, and the estimate is that many more remain to be catalogued. The images on the Burrup span an extraordinary range of time. Some were made recently, within the last few hundred years. Some were made thousands of years ago, and some, the most ancient, worn by wind and rain and oxidation to the point where they are barely distinguishable from the natural surface of the rock, may have been made at the very beginning of human habitation on the continent, possibly earlier. Among the images on the Burrup are depictions of animals that are no longer present in the region, animals whose populations were driven back or eliminated by the changing climate and the management practices of the post-glacial period. The thylacine, the Tasmanian tiger, extinct on the mainland for at least 3,000 years, appears on the Burrup stones. Animals that may be megafauna, recognizable in their size and proportions as species that disappeared 40,000 years ago, appear in the oldest layers of the carving sequence. And among the human figures depicted on the Burrup, there is a range of physical representation that has attracted the attention of researchers. Figures with different proportions, figures that seem to fall into distinct typological categories, figures that have been interpreted by some analysts as representing genuinely different kinds of people, different groups, different physical types, different presences in the landscape. The stone is not a photograph. The carvers were artists, not anatomists, and their representations were shaped by cultural conventions that we do not fully understand. Reading ethnic or physical categories from stylized rock art is a fraught enterprise that has produced more speculation than knowledge. But the Burrup faces the sea, and the sea, 40,000 years ago, was much further away. The people who first carved on those stones may have been the people who came off the boats, the first arrivals, the founding population, the ones who established the first human presence in this corner of the world. And what they carved in those first uncertain years of a new continent's human history was their world as they saw it. The animals, the landscape, the people, their people, whoever they were. Extended reflection, the rain that came before memory. In the deserts of Central Australia, there are clay pans, flat-bottomed depressions in the landscape that fill with water after heavy rains and dry out again in the weeks that follow. The clay pans are not permanent features of the landscape. They come and go with the rainfall, filling and emptying in patterns that make them unpredictable as water sources, but extraordinarily rich as habitats when they hold water. After rain, a clay pan in Central Australia is one of the most remarkable spectacles in the natural world. Animals come from enormous distances to drink and to breed at the temporary water. Birds arrive in their thousands, pelicans, herons, ibis, ducks, stilts, descending on what was, days ago, cracked clay. Frogs emerge from estivation in the soil, where they have been waiting, sometimes for years, for exactly this kind of rain. Fish, whose eggs have survived dormant in the dried sediment, hatch and grow with extraordinary speed in the temporary pools. The clay pans of the interior were, for the ancient people who knew how to use them, a resource of extraordinary value. They required the kind of knowledge that can only be accumulated over generations of observation. The knowledge of which clay pans hold water longest after which rains, of which directions to travel to find the animals that are following the water, of how to time movements across the landscape to take advantage of temporary abundance without being caught too far from permanent water when the temporary water fails. This knowledge, the knowledge of a landscape that is most of the time harsh and unforgiving but occasionally, briefly, extraordinarily generous, is embedded in the songlines and the oral traditions of the desert communities. It is old knowledge, tested over many thousands of years, refined by the experience of generations who made catastrophically fatal mistakes when they got it wrong and survived to pass on their knowledge when they got it right. And it is knowledge that, like all the knowledge accumulated in the long human history of Australia, did not arise from nothing. It was built layer by layer, generation by generation, by people who were paying attention, by people who were, in the truest sense, reading the landscape as a text, learning its language, mastering its grammar. Some of those people are the ancestors of the communities alive today, and some of them the very oldest, the ones whose knowledge formed the foundation on which later knowledge was built, may have been people whose physical characteristics and genetic lineages did not survive into the present, people who gave their knowledge to the people who came after them, even as they themselves disappeared. The knowledge that survives may be older than the people who hold it. In the landscape of Australia, that is not surprising. It may be the most Australian thing of all. Extended reflection, between the questions. Science is comfortable with questions. It is built for them. The whole machinery of hypothesis and experiment and peer review is a mechanism for approaching questions systematically, for ruling out wrong answers and narrowing toward right ones. But there is a kind of question that science approaches differently than others. Questions where the available evidence is genuinely ambiguous. Questions where the most sensitive and accurate tools still produce results that cannot be cleanly interpreted. Questions where the act of asking is itself politically and ethically complicated, where the conclusions that different people draw from the same data depend as much on who those people are and what they already believe as on what the data actually shows. The question of ancient human diversity in Australia is one of those questions, and the result is that it lives in a strange and uncomfortable space, acknowledged in the specialist literature through careful and qualified language, largely absent from popular accounts of Australian prehistory, resistant to the kind of definitive resolution that would allow it to be settled and moved past. What lives in that space is not comfortable. It is not orderly. It is not the kind of thing that fits into a sentence or a headline or a 3-minute news segment. It requires sitting with uncertainty, with the recognition that the world is more complicated than the maps we draw of it, with the understanding that there are things we do not yet know and may not know for a long time. But sitting with uncertainty is not the same as not knowing anything. The uncertainty is itself structured. It points in directions. It has a shape. And the shape it has, the direction it points, is toward a past for Australia that was richer and stranger and more peopled by distinct and different groups of human beings than the standard account allows. The mummies, whose DNA match no known population, are the most dramatic expression of that uncertainty. But they are not the only expression. Every anomalous skull, every genomic signal of unknown admixture, every oral tradition that speaks of earlier people, every layer of rock art whose makers cannot be identified, all of these are expressions of the same underlying reality. Australia was not settled by a single wave of uniform people who then lived in isolation for 65,000 years. It was settled by extraordinary people in circumstances that were complex and that we are still working to understand. And the story of their time here is one of the most remarkable and least known chapters in the human story. We are still learning to read it, and that, in the dark and quiet of a late night, as sleep approaches and the mind loosens its grip on the ordinary world, feels like exactly the right place to be. Learning to read, in the oldest library in the world, with the oldest books. Sleep now. Let the reading continue in your dreams. Extended reflection. The long silence and what fills it. There are places in Australia where the silence is so deep that it has a texture to it, a presence, in the great red open spaces of the interior, where the nearest town might be 300 kilometers away, and the nearest other person might be further than that. The silence is not simply the absence of sound. It is a positive thing, something that presses gently against the skin, something that makes the mind slower and clearer and more aware of its own weight. The Aboriginal Australians who have inhabited these silences for 65,000 years did not experience them as empty. The interior is full of meaning, full of relationship, full of the presence of the ancestral beings whose activities created the landscape and who are still, in the Aboriginal understanding, present in the landscape, moving through it, speaking through its features, available to those who know how to listen. This is not metaphor in the Aboriginal understanding. It is not poetry in the Western sense, not a beautiful way of describing a material reality that is understood to be fundamentally different. It is a different understanding of what reality is, a different ontology, a different account of what the world contains. The Western scientific tradition understands the landscape as a material substrate, rock and soil and water, and the biological organisms that live in and on it. The Aboriginal Australian tradition understands the landscape as a relational field, a web of connections between people, country, ancestral beings, and the ongoing acts of creation that produce the world and continue to produce it. These two understandings are not simply incompatible. They are capable of producing knowledge about the same landscape that is complementary rather than contradictory. The scientific understanding of the Willandra Lake system, the geological history, the paleoclimatic record, the archaeological sequence, does not disprove the Pakenchi understanding of the same landscape as a place saturated with ancestral presence and governed by relationships that predate the historical record. The two forms of understanding are looking at different dimensions of the same reality. And when we are trying to understand something as profound and as mysterious as the full history of human presence in Australia, when we are trying to recover the story of people who lived and died here before writing, before recorded history, before any of the documentary technologies that modern civilization depends on, We need all the forms of knowing we can get. We need the genomics, we need the physical anthropology, we need the archaeology, we need the eDNA and the ground-penetrating radar and the submarine surveys. We need the oral traditions, the astronomical knowledge, the landscape memories preserved in song and story across thousands of generations. And we need, perhaps most of all, the willingness to sit in the silence and let it be what it is. To not rush past the parts that do not yet have answers. To not fill the space of genuine uncertainty with false certainty in either direction. The mystery of the Australian mummies is real. The DNA that matched no known population is real. The pattern of anomalous physical characteristics in the fossil record is real. The genomic signals of unknown ancient admixture are real. And they are, for now, unresolved. They are the silence at the center of the story, the thing that all the data points toward but cannot yet reach. In that silence, there is room for wonder, for the kind of awe that comes from standing at the edge of what is known and looking out into what is not, for the recognition that the universe and the human story within it is larger and stranger and more magnificent than any of our current maps can hold. Stand there for a moment in the silence, let the wonder be what it is, and then let sleep come, because the questions will still be here in the morning, and the earth will still be red, and the ancient bones will still be waiting. Extended reflection. The gift of not knowing. We live in a culture that is, in many ways, uncomfortable with not knowing. The machinery of information, the constant availability of answers, the expectation that any question can be resolved with a search. These have made the experience of genuine, deep uncertainty feel like a failure rather than a position of appropriate humility before the complexity of reality. But not knowing, held honestly and with the intention to continue seeking, is not failure. It is the beginning of every worthwhile inquiry. It is the condition of possibility for every genuine discovery. The story of the Australian mummies and their anomalous DNA is a story about not knowing. It is a story about what happens at the frontier of knowledge, where the questions are real and the answers are incomplete, and the work of understanding is ongoing. It is a story about the way that the natural world, the actual physical material record of the past, refuses to be simpler than it is, refuses to conform to the stories we prefer, refuses to give up its secrets on any schedule other than its own. And it is a story about the importance of the people who have been in relationship with this mystery for 65,000 years. The Aboriginal Australians and Torres Strait Islanders, who are the living inheritors of the deepest human tradition on Earth, are not peripheral to this story. They are central to it. They are the people without whom the mystery cannot be fully approached, because they hold dimensions of understanding. In their oral traditions, their relationships to country, their knowledge of the landscape, that no external science can replicate or replace. The partnership between that knowledge and the tools of modern science, conducted with genuine respect and genuine equity, is the only way that the full story of Australia's deep human past will ever be told. And that story, when it is finally told, when the genomics is clearer and the archaeology is deeper, and the partnerships are stronger and the ethical frameworks are more mature, will be one of the most remarkable stories in the history of our species, because it is the story of us, of all of us, of the extraordinary, tenacious, curious, meaning-making, beauty-finding species that we are. The species that crossed the sea 65,000 years ago in boats made of materials that have long since dissolved, and set foot on a red continent at the edge of the world, and looked up at the stars and began to sing. That song has not stopped. It is being sung right now in living communities across Australia. And tonight, in the quiet, you are part of the audience. Rest well, the song will be there in the morning. Extended reflection. The river carries everything. The Murray River is the longest river in Australia, running approximately 2,500 kilometres from the snowy mountains of the Australian Alps to the Southern Ocean near Adelaide. Along with its tributaries, the Darling, the Murrumbidgee, the Goulburn, it drains the most productive agricultural land in Australia and has been the centre of human life in the southeastern part of the continent for as long as humans have been in Australia. The river's banks are among the most archaeologically rich in Australia. Over thousands of years, the river provided reliable water, abundant fish, rich wetland resources, and a highway through the interior that connected communities across an enormous area. Where resources are abundant and reliable, human populations concentrate. Where populations concentrate, cultures develop in complexity. The Murray-Darling system supported some of the densest and most complex hunter-gatherer populations in the world before European contact. The archaeological record along the Murray reflects this density. Middens, the refuse heaps of shells and bones and discarded objects that mark ancient habitation sites, line the river's banks in concentrations that have been the subject of intensive study for decades. Burial grounds are numerous, tool assemblages are rich, and the skeletal record, sampled from burial sites across the length of the river, shows the same pattern that characterizes the Australian fossil record more broadly, a range of physical variation that is wider than any single founding population should easily produce, and that has prompted ongoing debate about its causes and its implications. The river itself is a metaphor for what we are discussing tonight. It carries everything that falls into it: the soil from the mountains, the organic material from the forests, the sediment from the floodplains, and it delivers all of it, mixed and transformed, to the sea. The populations along its banks were similarly mixed, similarly transformed by the constant contact and movement that a major river system promotes. And in the mixing, some things were lost and some things were preserved. The genome of a living Yorta person carries the traces of every population that has ever been part of the story of the river. The earliest arrivals, whatever distinct groups they may have been. The later waves of people who moved into the region as the continent's population grew and shifted. The Denisovan contribution that is present in all Aboriginal Australian genomes. The unknown ancient admixture signals that appear in the deepest layers of the genomic record. The river carries everything, and the people carry the river. That is the nature of a long inheritance. It is never simple. It is never pure. It is always the product of everything that has come before, mixed and transformed by the journey, arriving at the present moment as something richer and stranger, and more interesting than any of its individual sources. That is what the bones say. That is what the DNA says. That is what the oral traditions say in their own language. And that is what the river says, moving through the dark, carrying the water of the mountains toward the sea, unmindful of the ancient mystery it carries along with it. Extended reflection, the weight of 65,000 years. 65,000 years is a number that is easy to say and almost impossible to feel. Let us try. A generation is, let us say, 25 years. That is the average age at which a parent has a child, counted across many cultures and many historical periods. 25 years per generation gives us 2,600 generations in 65,000 years. Think of your own grandmother or your grandfather, if they were still alive when you were young enough to know them. Think of their face, their voice, the particular quality of their presence in a room, their habits and their stories, and the things they knew that they tried to pass on. That is one generation back. Now, think of going back twice that far. Your great-grandparents, people you may never have met. People whose photographs, if any exist, show faces that are recognizable as kin but strange in their foreignness, their historical moment, the way they held their bodies for a photograph taken in a world that is gone. That is 2 generations. Now go back 100 generations, 500, 1,000. The numbers lose their specificity. The human faces dissolve into abstraction. We cannot imagine the individuals anymore, cannot hold them as persons in the way that we hold our grandparents as persons. But they were persons. Every one of those 2,600 generations of people who carried the Australian story forward were full human beings, complete in their consciousness and their feeling and their capacity for love and fear and joy and grief. They had names, they had favorites among their children, they had specific particular relationships to the places where they lived, relationships that were the product of their own lifetimes of experience, and the accumulated inheritance of everyone who had come before them. And at the end of that long chain of persons, there are people alive today. Aboriginal Australians and Torres Strait Islanders, who are, in the most literal biological sense, the continuation of the oldest continuous human tradition in the world, who carry in their DNA the traces of every one of those 2,600 generations. The weight of that is, if you let yourself feel it, almost unbearable in its significance. It is also, if you let yourself feel it, incredibly beautiful. The human story is long. It is deep. It is carried in living people, in their bodies, in their memories, in their songs, in their relationships to the places where they and their ancestors have lived. And Australia is where the longest chapter of that story was written. Rest in that knowledge tonight. Let it carry you into sleep. Let the weight of 65,000 years be, for once, not a burden, but a comfort. You are part of a long story. We all are. And the story goes on.